Welcome to Luke's Stories, where camping isn't all about campfires and stars, but also nightmares in the dark. My name is Randy Smith, and back in 2015 I decided to take my RV up to Lake Superior Provincial Park in Ontario for some peace and quiet. Being cooped up in the city was starting to make me feel like a sardine in a can, and I figured some fresh air might do me good. Besides, I've always believed that nature and I have an understanding. I don't bother it, and it doesn't bother me. I've never been the rugged outdoorsman type. My idea of hiking involves a well-marked trail and a picnic at the end. But the allure of the open road and the promise of solitude were too tempting to pass up. So I packed my essentials, a week's worth of snacks, a stack of books I'd been meaning to read, and enough coffee to fuel a small army. The drive was picturesque, with the trees flaunting their autumn colours like they were showing off. By the time I reached the park, the sun was casting golden hues over the lake, and I felt a sense of calm wash over me. I found a secluded spot near the water, set up camp, and made myself a cup of coffee. This isn't so bad, I thought. Maybe I should write a book, Randy's Adventures in the Wild. As dusk settled, I decided to light a campfire. There's something hypnotic about watching flames dance. It's like nature's television. I was roasting marshmallows because what's a camping trip without s'mores, when I heard footsteps crunching leaves behind me. "Evening," a voice said. I turned to see a man standing at the edge of my campsite. He was tall and gaunt, with unkempt hair and clothes that looked like they'd been through a war zone. His eyes had a peculiar glint, one that made me instinctively uneasy. "Evening," I replied cautiously. "Can I help you with something?" "Just passing through," he said, smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Jedediah, but folks call me Jed." "Randy," I offered, though he hadn't asked. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" He stepped closer, eyeing the marshmallows. "Sure is. Mind if I join you for a bit?" Every alarm bell in my head was ringing, but I didn't want to be rude. "Actually, I was just about to turn in. Long drive and all." He tilted his head, the smile fading. "Fair enough. You take care now." "Will do," I said, watching as he disappeared into the shadows. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Well, that wasn't creepy at all," I muttered, deciding it was indeed time to call it a night. I extinguished the fire and secured the RV. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds chirping and the smell of pine. I convinced myself that I'd overreacted the night before. Maybe Jed was just a harmless drifter. After breakfast, I decided to explore a nearby trail. I left a note on the dashboard, a habit from watching too many true crime shows, grabbed my backpack and set off. The trail was serene, with sunlight filtering through the canopy and leaves crunching underfoot. I was about an hour in when I noticed something odd, a campsite just off the path, but it looked abandoned. Curious, I ventured closer. Tents were collapsed, and belongings were strewn about as if the occupants had left in a hurry. Unease settled in my stomach. "This is how people end up in horror movies," I joked nervously to myself. I decided to head back. As I turned, I nearly bumped into Jed. "Whoa! You startled me," I exclaimed. "Sorry about that," he said, though he didn't sound sorry at all. "What brings you here?" "Just hiking," I replied, trying to sound casual. "You?" "Same," he said, his gaze fixed on me. "Shame about what happened here." "Yeah, looks like they left in a hurry." He chuckled softly, or something made them leave. I swallowed hard. "Well, I should get going." "Don't let me keep you," he said, stepping aside. I walked briskly back to the trail, feeling his eyes on me the whole time. By the time I reached my RV, my heart was pounding. Maybe it's time to move on to another site, I thought. I started packing up when I heard a rustling behind me. I spun around, half expecting Jed, but it was another man, this one wearing a park ranger uniform. "Sorry to startle you," he said. "I'm Ranger Thompson, just making my rounds." "Oh, thank goodness," I sighed in relief. "Randy Farnsworth. Everything all right? You look a bit shaken." I debated whether to mention Jed, but decided I might sound paranoid. "Just had an odd encounter earlier. Do you know a man named Jedediah around here?" The ranger's expression darkened. "Jedediah Clark? Yeah, goes by Jed." He nodded grimly. "We've had reports about him. I'd advise you to be cautious. He's not well." "Not well how?" I pressed. "Look, it's probably best if you relocate to a more populated area of the park," he suggested. "Safety in numbers." "Understood," I said, feeling a knot in my stomach. "Thanks for the warning." As he left, I hurried to finish packing. Just as I was about to start the engine, I realized I'd left my map on the picnic table. I stepped out to grab it, when something heavy struck me from behind. Everything went black. I awoke to a splitting headache and found myself tied to a chair inside what looked like an old cabin. The room was dimly lit by a single lantern, casting eerie shadows on the walls adorned with hunting trophies. "Rise and shine," came Jed's voice from the darkness. "What do you want?" I demanded, struggling against the ropes. He stepped into the light, a sinister smile playing on his lips. "Company. Is that too much to ask?" "Kidnapping isn't exactly the way to make friends," I retorted. He laughed. "Oh, but we're past pleasantries now. Look, if it's money you want—" "Money?" he interrupted. "You think this is about money?" "No, all this is about survival." "Survival?" He began pacing. "City folks like you come here thinking you own the place, leaving your trash, making noise, disrupting the balance. I'm sorry if I—" "Too late for apologies," he snapped. "You and your kind are a blight." "You're not making any sense," I said, trying to keep him talking while I worked at the knots. He pulled out a hunting knife, examining it thoughtfully. "Sense? Sense is living off the land, respecting its laws, not hiding in metal boxes on wheels." "Okay, noted. I'll just be on my way and promise to leave nature untouched," I said. He shook his head slowly. "Can't let you do that." Before I could respond, there was a loud bang on the door. "Jedediah Clark, this is Ranger Thompson. Open up." Jed's eyes flickered with rage. "You just couldn't stay quiet, could you?" As he moved toward the door, adrenaline surged through me. I managed to loosen the ropes enough to free one hand. Without thinking, I grabbed a heavy wooden stool and waited. As Jed turned back, I swung with all my might. The stool connected with his shoulder, causing him to drop the knife and stumble. "You little," he growled. I didn't wait for him to finish. I bolted for the back door, bursting into the cool night air. My RV was parked nearby, and I sprinted toward it, fumbling with the keys. As I jumped inside and started the engine, I saw Jed appear in the side mirror, fury etched on his face. I didn't look back. Later, I learned that Jed had been evading capture for months. He was a former survivalist who lost his grip on reality after a tragic accident claimed his family. As for me, next time someone suggests a nature trip, I'll politely decline. I'm outdoorsy in that I like having drinks on patios. My name is Austin Gibson, and this happened back in 2007 in Shawnee National Forest, Illinois, when I first took a temporary ranger job there to help with the busy fall season. Never suspecting I'd leave that place with shaking hands and a heart full of questions. I remember stepping into that small ranger station around late September, feeling pretty good because I'd managed to snag a cheap motel room in town that morning. I had a bland cheese sandwich for breakfast, just something out of the convenience store freezer section, and washed it down with watery coffee. I wore a faded uniform passed down from a previous hire who'd left mustard stains near the left pocket. It smelled like stale sweat and cheap detergent, but I was just glad to have work. I was 25, broke, and eager to prove myself reliable. I liked the quiet of the forest trails, the dense maples and oaks, and the smell of damp leaves after last week's rain. We had a small team, just me and 2 others on rotation that day. Tom, older and with a bushy beard that he tied with a rubber band, always joked about his ex-wife and how her new husband sold fancy lawnmowers. And Gina, in her early 40s, usually wore a baseball cap over short-cropped hair. She had a habit of humming some old tune I couldn't place whenever she got nervous. She'd say, "Pat, you know that feeling when you think the woods are just a bit too still?" I didn't know what she meant back then. I thought forests were supposed to be quiet. That morning, Gina handed me a radio and said, "Don't wander off without checking in. It's not summer camp season, but we still get the odd hiker." By noon, I was on a trail known as Pine Hollow Path, which, despite the name, had more oaks than pines. The canopy let through thin beams of light, and the forest floor was scattered with red and brown leaves. I came across a half-eaten energy bar wrapper on the path, which struck me as odd because we usually lectured visitors about leaving no trash. I stuffed it in my pocket. About an hour later, I stumbled on something far more disturbing, a torn jacket sleeve snagged on a low branch. It looked recent, maybe a day old, and the fabric was stiff with something dark. I didn't want to think about it. That's when I radioed Tom. "Hey, found a torn piece of clothing. Could be a lost hiker. Anything on the logs?" Tom answered with a yawn. "We had a party of 3 who checked in yesterday. They should have been out by now." That sent a chill into my chest, and I began scanning the underbrush with more care. I followed a faint trail of broken twigs and disturbed leaves off the main path. About 20 feet in, I smelled something unpleasant, like old meat left out on a warm countertop. I advanced slowly, heart tapping at my ribs. In a small clearing behind a fallen tree, I found the body of a man. He looked about 40, wearing a hiking vest and boots. His left arm lay twisted at a strange angle, and part of his torso had been torn open. The sight made my stomach lurch. I stepped back, pressed my hand against my mouth, and tried to breathe through it. Then I spoke into the radio with forced calm. "Tom," I said, "I've got a deceased male hiker here. Looks like an animal attack." Gina broke in, her voice uneasy. "Animal attacks are rare here. Are you sure?" I didn't answer her. I just gave them my coordinates. While I waited, I squatted down, thinking maybe the poor guy slipped and got mauled by a coyote or something. But coyotes don't usually leave bodies like that. I took in the surroundings, noticing deep scratches on a nearby tree trunk, higher than my shoulders. There was a pattern, something I couldn't quite place, but it definitely wasn't from a raccoon or a bobcat. When Tom and Gina arrived, they were both grim-faced. Tom tried to hide his shock. Gina stopped humming. She just stared and shook her head. We decided to search for the other 2 hikers from that party of 3. Tom radioed the station to call for authorities. We couldn't just leave, not with the possibility of survivors. We moved deeper into the woods, spreading out but staying close enough to yell if something happened. I remember wiping sweat off my forehead, even though it wasn't that hot. The silence weighed on me. Sometimes a branch cracked underfoot, and I jumped. Then we found another body. This time it was a woman, slumped against a boulder. Her pack was gone, her face frozen in a look of pain. She had similar wounds, and the ground around her was stained and scattered with damp leaves. I wish I hadn't eaten that cheese sandwich earlier. "Hello? Anybody out here?" I called. No answer. I heard Tom whisper, "This is bad, Pat." I nodded, my mouth dry. Gina, who walked a short distance away, suddenly shouted, "Found footprints!" We hurried over. There were large impressions in the soft earth, bigger than any mountain lion print I'd seen in guides. They looked like a cat's, but heavier. Deeper. "A cougar?" Tom asked. Gina shrugged. "Not impossible, but—" She trailed off. Something about these tracks bothered her. They showed long strides, more powerful than what we expected. We decided to keep searching for the 3rd hiker. The afternoon light was fading, and we had to use flashlights. Being out there as dusk approached set me on edge. I found myself talking just to break the tension. "Tom, remember that big raccoon we saw by the dumpsters yesterday?" Tom grunted. I tried a lame joke. "If that raccoon shows up now, I'll offer him my last candy bar to watch our backs." No one laughed. Then, at twilight, we heard a scream, quick and sharp. We ran toward it, stumbling over roots and rocks. We found the 3rd hiker, alive at first, a young guy in his 20s holding his side, crouched under a half-fallen tree. "Help!" he shouted, voice cracking. We rushed over, flashlights jumping. He looked terrified, eyes darting behind us as if expecting something to pounce. It took them. "It's out here." He didn't have to say more. We heard heavy steps in the brush, a soft rustling that made my skin prickle. We formed a semicircle around the wounded hiker, shining our beams into the dark trees. I saw a shape then, low and muscular, moving between trunks. No distinct silhouette, just movement. My heart thundered. Then it rushed forward. I could barely describe its form. A cat-like body, maybe 5 feet long, thick shoulders. Dark fur that blended with the night. It moved quietly at first, then Thump! It slammed into the injured hiker. He screamed. We shouted, shining lights into its face. I saw powerful jaws flash open and close. The man's screams turned into choking gasps. I stepped forward, but Tom grabbed my shoulder. "Pat, no, it's too late." Gina swung her flashlight at the creature's head and it hissed, a strange, sharp sound. Then it ran off into the darkness, leaving the man on the ground. He was gone. And that was only the beginning. We knelt beside him. He was gone. It had ended his life in seconds. Gina cursed under her breath. Tom looked like he might cry. I felt sick again, kneeling there trying to hold my flashlight steady. Now we had 3 dead hikers, a killer animal somewhere in the woods, and night pressing in on all sides. We made a plan to retreat to the station. The radio crackled as we tried to call for backup. Spotty reception. "We need the phone," I said. Tom nodded. We hurried back along the trail, our flashlights bouncing over tree trunks and roots. Gina whispered, "Don't run. Running sets it off." We moved briskly, but tried to look calm, which was impossible. I gripped my radio so hard my knuckles hurt. Halfway back, we realized something was keeping pace with us. Branches snapped lightly. I tried to catch a glimpse, but only saw shifting silhouettes. We picked up speed. "I'll buy us all dinner if we get out of this," I muttered. No one responded. I suppose we all wanted to pretend we were anywhere else, maybe at a diner with French fries and milkshakes, not stuck in the dark with a vicious predator. At one point, Tom lagged behind to catch his breath. "Go ahead," he said. "I'll be right there." Gina and I stopped, turned back. "Don't be stupid," she said. "We stick together." He nodded and lumbered forward, chest heaving. He was bigger than me, maybe 50 pounds heavier, and the fear weighed on him. We formed a tight group, shining lights in every direction. The woods smelled damp and earthy, and every sound set me on edge. We reached a fork in the path. By then I noticed fresh scratches on the bark of a large oak, long parallel marks, too clean to be random. We heard a sudden snapping of twigs and spun around. The creature rushed past our lights so fast I barely saw more than a dark shape. Tom shouted, "There!" But it moved in a blur. Gina and I tried to stand back to back with him. We breathed in quick, shallow gasps. I held a length of sturdy branch I'd picked up, though I doubted it would help much. A moment passed, maybe less. Then it struck again, hitting Tom this time. I swung the branch wildly, hitting only air. I saw Tom on the ground, coughing, struggling. Gina screamed at me to help him. I knelt and tried to pull him up. His chest and shoulder were torn, and his hands shook as he reached for me. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I tried to stop the bleeding with my jacket, but it was too much. His eyes fluttered. I pleaded, "Come on, Tom, don't leave me here, man." He said nothing else. Gina stood guard, flashlight shaking in her grip. The forest was too silent again. After a minute, I realized Tom was gone. My eyes stung with tears. I swallowed hard and said, "Gina, we have to run." We ran. I know I said not to run earlier, but we had no choice. Our boots pounded the dirt. The station wasn't far. The creature crashed through the brush behind us, keeping pace. My lungs burned and my mind spun. I tried to recall if there was a service rifle locked at the station. Maybe. Maybe not. Anything would help. Gina was ahead of me, her flashlight beam shaking. We broke through the last stand of trees and saw the faint light from the station's bulb. I fumbled for the door, keys rattling. Inside, I slammed it shut and pushed a heavy cabinet against it. Gina collapsed into a chair, gasping. "We lost Tom," she said flatly. I nodded, pressing my forehead against the door. We tried the landline phone, static. We tried the radio, no immediate response. Maybe the call had gone out earlier and help was on the way. Maybe not. While Gina searched for a first aid kit, I peered out a small window. Nothing but darkness and the suggestion of trees. I listened hard, hearing only the hum of the station's small fridge. There was a box of flares on a shelf, and I pulled one out, thinking maybe we could signal someone. I waited, half expecting the animal to burst in, but it didn't. Hours passed. Gina stayed quiet. I remember rummaging through a drawer and finding a half-eaten bag of pretzels. My throat was too tight to swallow. As the first hint of dawn broke, we dared to open the door a crack. The forest looked normal. Dew on leaves, pale light filtering through, no sign of the creature. No strange prints by the door. Nothing. We stepped outside, tense, every sense sharpened. We didn't talk about going back to look for the bodies. We just knew we had to get the proper authorities and show them. We found a ranger truck behind the station. Old, but it ran. Gina drove while I clutched the flare gun. My hands trembled with every bump in the dirt road. We made it out, but we carried what we saw inside our minds. When the sheriff's deputies and wildlife officers arrived later that day, they searched in teams, rifles ready. They found the bodies. They found unusual tracks. But I never heard a confident explanation. Maybe a rogue predator wandered in from another region. Maybe something escaped from a private collector's estate. I don't know. Gina and I never got a satisfying answer. They patrolled heavily for weeks. Nothing else turned up. Eventually, people said it must have been a one-time tragedy. I still think about it. I still see that creature's eyes in the beam of my flashlight. Sometimes I wonder if it's slipped away to another stretch of forest, still hungry, still waiting to surprise someone. I can't shake that thought. Even today, when I step outside at dusk, I pause and listen harder than I did before, just in case. My name is Logan Cooper, and this happened to me on September 14th, 1992. I've been a search and rescue officer for almost 2 decades now. I've seen a lot, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened in the fall of '88. It was one of those years when the forest seemed to breathe easier, the air crisp and cool, the leaves transforming into a kaleidoscope of red, orange, and yellow. Most of my days were spent patrolling the trails and helping lost hikers find their way back. It was a job I loved, one that gave me a sense of purpose and connection to nature. It started as a regular Friday. I was in the ranger station, sipping on a cup of coffee, the kind that's more bitter than soothing, when the call came in. A family reported their teenage son missing. They were camping in the dense woods of the Cascade Range, near a spot we locals called Blackwood Hollow. It wasn't a popular area. In fact, it was pretty remote, which made it all the more concerning. The boy, Kyle Thompson, had been missing for nearly 12 hours. I grabbed my gear, radioed my partner Rick, and we headed out. Rick was a good guy, a bit younger than me, with a sharp mind and quick wit. We joked about how every rescue mission felt like we were stepping into an old western, with us as the cowboys riding into the unknown. We reached Blackwood Hollow by late afternoon. The place had an eerie calm to it, a stillness that seemed to swallow sound. We met Kyle's parents at their campsite. They were frantic, the mother on the verge of tears, the father pacing like a caged animal. They explained that Kyle had wandered off the previous night, saying he was going to explore, but he never came back. Rick and I started our search, moving in a grid pattern, calling out Kyle's name. We had a good system, years of experience between us. As dusk settled, the forest grew darker, and our flashlights barely cut through the thickening gloom. There's something about the woods at night that gets under your skin, makes you feel like you're being watched. About an hour in, we found Kyle's backpack. It was lying at the base of a massive oak tree, partially covered in leaves. Inside were typical teenage things. A flashlight, some snacks, a notebook, but no sign of Kyle. We pressed on, our shouts becoming more urgent. Then we heard it, a faint, distant cry. It was hard to pinpoint, but it was there. We followed the sound, moving quickly now, the urgency driving us forward. The cries led us deeper into the forest, to a part I wasn't familiar with. The trees were denser, the path narrower. It felt like we were being funneled into a trap. We came upon a clearing, and there, in the middle, was a small, dilapidated cabin. It looked abandoned, windows shattered, roof caved in. The cries were louder now, coming from inside. Rick and I exchanged a look. This wasn't right, but we had to find Kyle. We approached the cabin cautiously, flashlights sweeping the area. I called out, "Kyle, you in there?" No response, just the continued whimpering. We pushed the door open and the smell hit us first, damp, rotting wood mixed with something metallic. Blood. Inside the place was a mess, furniture overturned, debris everywhere. In the corner we saw him, Kyle, huddled and trembling, eyes wide with fear. But he wasn't alone. Standing over him was a figure, tall and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. Before we could react, the figure lunged at Rick, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. Rick went down, and I barely had time to draw my knife. I slashed at the figure, connecting with something solid. It hissed, a sound that made my skin crawl, and retreated into the shadows. I grabbed Kyle, pulling him to his feet. "Run!" I shouted, and we bolted out of the cabin. Rick was on the ground, clutching his side but alive. We made it to the clearing before I dared to look back. The figure was standing in the doorway, watching us, but it didn't follow. We helped Rick up, and with Kyle between us, we made our way back to the campsite as fast as we could. The whole time, I felt like we were being hunted, the trees closing in around us, but we didn't stop, didn't look back, until we were safely at the ranger station. Kyle's parents were relieved, their gratitude evident, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Rick was taken to the hospital, his wound deep but not life-threatening. I stayed behind, trying to piece together what had happened. The authorities were called, and a search was conducted, but the cabin was never found. Kyle's memory was hazy, filled with fragments of a nightmare he couldn't fully recall. He mentioned being lured by a voice, something that seemed human but wasn't. Weeks passed, and the incident was quietly swept under the rug. Officially, it was chalked up to a bear attack, though anyone who'd seen the wounds knew better. Rick recovered, but he left the job soon after. Said he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching. I stayed on, but Blackwood Hollow became a place I avoided. The forest felt different, like it had secrets best left undisturbed. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees, I sometimes hear that faint cry, a reminder of the things that lurk in the shadows of our world. Years later, the memory still haunts me, not just the encounter, but the sense of helplessness, the realization that there are things out there beyond our understanding. Kyle grew up, moved away, tried to forget. But I couldn't. It became a part of me, a shadow that followed wherever I went. One night I was having a beer with an old friend, Jason. He was another ranger, one who had his own stories of the strange and unexplainable. We were sitting on my porch, watching the stars, when I finally told him about that night in Blackwood Hollow. He listened, a thoughtful look on his face, then nodded. "I've heard similar stories," he said. "Different places, different faces, but the same kind of presence. Some say it's a spirit, others think it's something more primal, more ancient." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of his words hanging in the air. It didn't bring me comfort, but it felt good to share the burden, to know I wasn't alone in my experience. Life went on, as it does. I kept doing my job, helping those lost in the wilderness, always with a cautious eye on the tree line. I never went back to Blackwood Hollow, and neither did Rick. It became one of those places with a story attached, a whispered legend among the rangers. In the end, I think that's what it was, a legend. Something that exists on the edges of our reality, only revealing itself when we stray too far into the unknown, and maybe that's for the best. Some things are meant to remain hidden, their mysteries left unsolved. I still wonder about that night, about what I saw, and what might have happened if we hadn't escaped. It's a question that lingers, unanswered, a reminder of the thin line between our world and whatever lies beyond. And as long as I'm alive, I'll carry that memory with me, a testament to the things we'll never fully understand. My name is Sophia Fisher. I'm 38 years old, and I work as a children's book illustrator. This happened just last fall when I decided to take my RV to Ocala National Forest in Florida. I wasn't looking for trouble, only a bit of peace and quiet, a break from the relentless deadlines, and hopefully some inspiration for my next book. I thought the stillness of the forest would calm my racing thoughts. Instead, it left me with nightmares I can't escape. It was early October, and the forest was alive with color. The cypress trees, draped in Spanish moss, towered around me as I navigated my RV down a narrow dirt road. My dog Max sat in the passenger seat, his ears pricked with curiosity. He was always my loyal shadow, and I was glad for his company. I parked near Juniper Springs, a spot I'd chosen for its seclusion and beauty. The spring shimmered in the afternoon sunlight, crystal clear and eerily still. I set up camp, unpacking my sketch pad and a few supplies. Sheriff Benson, a gruff local I'd met at the trailhead, had warned me to stick to the marked trails and not wander after dark. He mentioned something about the Devil's Lantern, but I waved him off. Every place had its ghost stories. I wasn't here for folklore. I was here to work. The first night was uneventful, though the silence felt heavy. The usual hum of crickets and frogs seemed muted. Max growled a few times at nothing in particular, but I figured he was just adjusting to the new surroundings. I spent the next day sketching the landscape, trying to capture the way the sunlight filtered through the trees. Max explored the area, occasionally coming back to nudge me for attention. I was starting to feel relaxed, even inspired, until night fell. It started with the light. At first I thought it was a firefly glowing faintly through the trees, but the glow grew brighter, flickering like a lantern. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the RV. Max followed, his hackles raised. The light hovered just beyond the edge of the campsite, swaying slightly as if someone were carrying it. "Hello?" I called out, shining my flashlight toward it. No response. The light retreated, bobbing deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, I took a few steps closer. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" Max barked sharply, snapping me out of my daze. I realized my feet were inches from the trail's edge, and the lantern was much farther away than I'd thought. It wasn't waiting for me. It was leading me. I backed away, pulling Max inside the RV and locking the door. The light flickered one last time before vanishing. I told myself it was a trick of the light or maybe a prank by some local kids, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling it left behind. I spent the morning sketching, but my hand felt unsteady. I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see the lantern again. When I finally looked down at my sketch pad, I froze. I hadn't been drawing the spring or the trees. I'd been drawing her. A woman, faint and glowing, stood at the edge of my page. Her face was obscured, but her outline was unmistakable. I hadn't drawn her intentionally. My hand had moved on its own. Max growled low in his throat, pulling me from my thoughts. He was staring at the door, his ears flattened. "It's okay, boy," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. That night, the whispers started. I woke to the sound of footsteps circling the RV. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the steps were too deliberate, too heavy. Max barked and scratched at the door, his teeth bared. Then I heard the laughter. It was faint, like a child giggling, but it sent a chill down my spine. I peered out the window but saw nothing. The footsteps stopped, and the laughter faded. I sat in the dark, clutching Max until the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees. The next morning, I decided to explore the trails, hoping to clear my head. Sheriff Benson's warning echoed in my mind, but I dismissed it. I couldn't let a few strange noises ruin my trip. I followed the marked trail for about a mile before I saw the carvings, symbols, circles, crosses, and spirals etched into the bark of several trees. They looked old, weathered by time, but they didn't feel random. I sketched them into my notebook, intending to research them later. As I turned back toward the RV, I saw it again. The lantern. This time, it wasn't distant. It hovered just a few yards away, glowing faintly in the dim light of the forest. My heart pounded as I stared at it, unable to move. Then it began to drift, pulling me deeper into the woods. "Sophia?" The voice was soft, almost melodic, and it seemed to come from the light itself. Max barked furiously, breaking the spell. I turned and ran, dragging him behind me. When I reached the RV, I slammed the door shut and didn't leave for the rest of the day. By the time night fell, I was ready to leave. I'd packed most of my things and planned to drive out first thing in the morning. But the forest had other plans. The lantern appeared again, closer than ever, just outside the RV. Its glow seeped through the windows, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Max barked and growled, his body pressed against my legs. Then I heard the knock. It was soft, polite, almost human. But when I looked out the window, no one was there, just the lantern swaying gently. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, until it echoed through the RV. "Leave me alone!" I shouted, clutching a flashlight like a weapon. The knocking stopped. Silence. Then the door creaked open. The lantern floated inside, its glow illuminating the cramped space. Behind it, the figure of a woman took shape. Her face was pale, her eyes empty voids, and her hair floated around her as if under water. She reached out a hand, her voice echoing in my mind. "Stay with me." I screamed and threw the flashlight, shattering the lantern's glow. The figure dissolved into mist, and the RV was plunged into darkness. Max whimpered, and I held him tightly, tears streaming down my face. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, I started the RV and drove away without looking back. Max sat in the passenger's seat, silent and watchful. My hands trembled on the wheel, but I didn't stop until I was miles from the forest. A week later, I found the sketches I'd made during the trip. The glowing woman was in every one of them, standing among the trees, watching me. I burned them all. I haven't been back to the woods since. Sometimes, though, I see a faint light in the distance when I close my eyes, and sometimes I hear her voice, Sophia. My name is Mateo Miller, and this happened in November of last year at Lake Diston in Flagler County, Florida. I thought I knew the wilderness. I thought I was prepared for anything nature could throw at me. But I was wrong, dead wrong. I'd convinced my girlfriend, Megan, 31, and my best friend, Sam, 30, to join me on this trip. We planned to camp by the lake, explore its hidden beauty, and document everything for my hiking blog, Into the Wild. Sam would handle the filming with his fancy drone, Megan would bring her sharp wit to our banter, and I'd lead the way. I'd heard whispers about the lake's haunting reputation. Locals claimed it was cursed or haunted, but I shrugged it off. Every place has its ghost stories, right? The first day was uneventful. We set up camp near the shore, close enough to launch our kayaks but far enough from the waterline to avoid gators. The towering cypress trees, draped in Spanish moss, cast long shadows over the still water, their reflections rippling like an oil painting. The place was eerily quiet. No cars, no planes overhead, just the occasional croak of a bullfrog or the splash of something unseen in the water. My tent had a tear along the seam, and I cursed myself for not checking it before we left. Megan teased me mercilessly while patching it with duct tape. Sam was already flying his drone, narrating his shots like a nature documentary host. Everything seemed fine until the sun dipped below the horizon. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that set my teeth on edge. It wasn't an animal call, and it wasn't the wind. It was a whisper, faint, just beyond the edge of our camp. It sounded like someone saying my name. Mateo. I sat up, heart pounding, and scanned the darkness. The campfire had died down to embers, and the shadows of the trees stretched unnaturally long, almost reaching the tents. I told myself it was just my imagination and lay back down, but the whisper came again. Mateo. This time it was closer, almost in my ear. I shot up and unzipped my tent, stepping out into the cold night air. Megan stirred and mumbled something, but Sam snored on, oblivious. I scanned the camp with my flashlight, but saw nothing unusual, just trees and shadows. The whisper didn't come back, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I chalked the whisper up to a dream, though Megan noticed the dark circles under my eyes. "Bad night?" she asked, smirking as she sipped her coffee. I shrugged it off. Sam was buzzing with excitement. "You won't believe what I saw on the drone footage," he said, pulling out his laptop. We gathered around as he played the video. Most of it was scenic shots of the lake and forest, but at one point, the drone had hovered near the waterline and caught something odd. A figure, blurry and humanoid, crouched among the cypress roots. Its proportions were wrong, its arms seemed too long, its head too small. "Probably a trick of the light," I said, though the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Megan wasn't convinced. "That's not a trick of the light, Mateo. That's a person, or something pretending to be one." The whispers came back that night, but this time I wasn't the only one who heard them. Megan shook me awake around 2 a.m., her face pale in the dim glow of her flashlight. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, straining to listen. The whispers were faint but unmistakable, circling the camp. They didn't sound like one voice, but several, overlapping and disjointed. Sam stumbled out of his tent, rubbing his eyes. "What the hell is going on?" he asked groggily. Before I could answer, Megan pointed to the edge of the camp. A raccoon stood there, staring at us, Its eyes glinted in the light, but it didn't move, didn't blink. It just stood there, unnaturally still. Then it turned and walked away, on two legs. By now, we were all on edge. The tension between Megan and me was palpable, and Sam was growing increasingly jittery. His drone had stopped working entirely, its feed glitching out every time he tried to fly it. "It's like something's jamming the signal," he muttered, fiddling with the controls. We decided to hike deeper into the woods, hoping to clear our heads. As we walked, we found strange markings carved into the trees, symbols I didn't recognize. Megan took pictures with her phone, muttering about sending them to a folklorist friend. The trail led us to a clearing where we spotted something that made my blood run cold. It was the figure from Sam's drone footage, crouched by the water. Only now it wasn't blurry. It was real. Its skin was pale and stretched taut over sharp bones, its eyes black and soulless. It moved like a puppet on broken strings, jerky and unnatural. When it turned its head to look at us, I felt a wave of nausea, so strong I thought I'd be sick. We bolted back to camp. That night, the whispers didn't circle the camp. They came inside it. They called our names, mimicking our voices. Megan's voice called from the woods, though she was right next to me. Sam's voice laughed from the darkness, though he was cowering in his tent. When I stepped out to confront whatever was out there, I saw it, standing at the edge of the firelight. The shape, the thing. It wasn't just one figure now. It was two, then three, then more, all shifting and blending together like smoke. They whispered, laughed, and reached for us with two long arms. "Back off!" I shouted, grabbing a burning stick from the fire and swinging it wildly. The figures recoiled but didn't disappear. Instead, they melted back into the shadows, leaving behind an oppressive silence. By dawn, we'd had enough. We packed up in record time and loaded the kayaks. Sam was pale and silent, clutching his camera like a lifeline. Megan refused to look at me, her face set in grim determination. As we paddled away from the campsite, I felt a strange sense of relief, until I noticed something floating in the water. It was Sam's drone. "How did that?" Sam began, but his voice cut off as we turned to look back at the shore. The figures were there, standing in the trees, watching us. One of them raised a hand in a mockery of a wave. We didn't stop paddling until we were miles away. Back home, we reviewed the footage from Sam's camera. Most of it was shaky and blurry, but one clip stood out. It was taken in camp, though none of us remembered filming it. The camera panned across the tents, then turned to the woods, where the figure stood, its black eyes fixed on the lens. Behind it, more shapes emerged from the trees, each one more twisted and grotesque than the last. The video ended abruptly, and for a long time none of us spoke. Megan and I broke up a month later. Sam stopped filming entirely. As for me, I haven't been back to the woods since. I still hear the whispers sometimes, though. Late at night, when I'm alone, they call my name, Matteo. My name is Jacob Roberts. I'm 42 years old, and this happened last October in Blackwater River State Forest, Florida. After my wife Karen passed away 6 months earlier, I found myself drifting. The house was too quiet, my mind too loud, and I thought maybe some time alone in nature would help me heal, or at least help me breathe again. Karen and I loved camping, especially at Blackwater Creek. It was one of the first places we visited together. So I loaded up my RV, packed my dog Daisy, and headed out, thinking I'd find some solace in the woods. I didn't know I'd be running for my life by the end of the trip. I arrived at the forest mid-afternoon, the October sunlight warm and golden through the pine trees. Blackwater Creek ran dark and slow, its tannin-stained water reflecting the sky like a mirror. The place hadn't changed much since Karen and I were here last, though the silence felt heavier this time, or maybe that was just me. As I set up camp, Daisy sniffed around, her tail wagging with excitement. She was a sweet Labrador retriever, my constant companion since Karen passed. If it weren't for Daisy, I probably wouldn't have left the house at all. Just as I finished settling in, an older man approached. He looked like he belonged in the woods, with his weathered face, flannel shirt, and a hunter's cap pulled low over his brow. "Name's Henry Watson," he said, extending a hand. "You camping here alone?" Just me and Daisy, I replied, shaking his hand. Why? Henry glanced toward the creek. This area's got some history. Folks around here call it cursed. Kids used to drown in that creek back in the old days. They say their spirits still wander, looking for someone to play with. I chuckled nervously. Ghost stories, huh? He didn't laugh. You hear a child calling out, you leave it alone. You hear me? Don't go looking. Ain't nothing good in these woods after dark. I thanked him for the warning, though I didn't take it seriously. I wasn't here for ghost stories. I was here to clear my head. That first night, the forest was eerily still. I sat by the fire, sipping a beer while Daisy lay at my feet. The sound of the crackling flames was the only thing breaking the silence. Around midnight, I woke to Daisy growling. Her ears were pricked, her body tense as she stared at the RV's door. I listened, my heart pounding. At first, I heard nothing, but then came the unmistakable sound of laughter, light and childlike, drifting through the night. I froze. It couldn't be a child, not out here. The laughter came again, closer this time, followed by soft footsteps circling the RV. Daisy barked, a deep, guttural sound I'd never heard from her before. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, shining the beam into the darkness. Hello? Is someone out there? Silence. The forest swallowed my words, and for a moment I thought I saw movement by the creek, a small figure darting behind a tree. But when I blinked, it was gone. I closed the door, locking it this time, and stayed awake until dawn. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. I told myself the laughter had been the wind, the footsteps an animal. But Daisy wasn't acting like herself. She stayed close to me, growling at nothing and refusing to leave the RV. Determined not to let my nerves ruin the trip, I took a hike along the creek. The trail was muddy from recent rain, and the water had risen higher than usual. About a mile in, I noticed something strange. Small handprints pressed into the mud along the bank. They were too small to belong to an adult, and the thought of a child wandering out here alone sent a chill down my spine. Further along, I found an old doll tangled in the roots of a cypress tree. Its dress was torn, and its painted face had faded with time, but it was unmistakably a child's toy. I picked it up, and an icy shiver ran through me, as if the air around me had turned cold. That's when I heard the voice. Help me! It was faint, coming from the woods to my left, a little girl's voice, trembling with fear. My heart raced. I knew what Henry had said, but what if someone really needed help? Hello? Where are you? Help me! The voice was closer now, leading me off the trail. I followed it, calling out, but I found nothing. No child, no footprints, just the whisper of the wind through the trees. I turned back toward the RV, and that's when I saw her. A girl, no older than 7, stood by the creek. She was pale, her dark hair dripping with water, and she wore a tattered white dress. She didn't speak, just stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. Are you okay? I asked, stepping closer. She pointed to the creek, her lips trembling. They're in the water. Before I could respond, she vanished, as if she'd never been there. I couldn't stop thinking about the girl. Who was she? Why had she disappeared? The questions gnawed at me as I sat in the RV that night, Daisy pressed against my leg. I considered leaving, but a part of me felt compelled to stay, as though the forest itself wouldn't let me go. The whispers started just after midnight. They were faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but they grew louder, filling the air with childlike giggles and cries for help. Daisy barked and growled, her fur standing on end. Then I saw them, handprints, small and wet, appearing on the RV windows. The whispers turned into a chorus, overlapping voices calling my name. Jacob! Jacob! Come play with us! Terrified, I grabbed a flashlight and flung open the door. The forest was alive with movement, shadows flitting between the trees, glowing eyes peering out from the darkness. And there, by the creek, was the girl again. She smiled this time, her teeth too sharp, her eyes too black. Stay with us, she whispered. I slammed the door shut, barricading it with whatever I could find. Daisy whined, pacing nervously as the RV shook, the voices growing louder. I could feel the weight of their presence pressing in, suffocating me. At dawn, I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed up as quickly as I could, throwing everything into the RV. Daisy barked furiously as I started the engine, her eyes fixed on the tree line. As I drove away, the whispers followed. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them. Children, dozens of them, standing by the creek. Their faces were pale, their eyes empty, and their mouths stretched into unnatural grins. At the center of them stood the girl, holding the doll I'd found. She waved at me, a mockery of innocence. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. Back home, I tried to put the experience behind me, but the memories lingered. A week later, I found the doll in the back of the RV. I knew I hadn't brought it with me. I burned it that night, watching the flames consume its tattered dress and faded face. But even as it turned to ash, I could still hear, "Jacob Roberts, come play with us." My name is Aidan Stevens, and in 2017 I decided to take a solo RV trip to the remote stretches of the Yukon Territory in Canada. I'd always been drawn to the solitude of the wilderness, a chance to escape the constant buzz of city life. This time, I wanted to clear my head after a tough breakup and maybe find some peace in the quiet expanse of nature. The drive up was long but beautiful. The dense forests, towering mountains, and winding rivers were a welcome sight. I set up camp near Kluane National Park, an area known for its glaciers and rugged terrain but not overcrowded with tourists. The spot was perfect, a clearing surrounded by tall pines with a clear view of the distant snow-capped peaks. After settling in, I decided to explore the nearby trails. The fresh air filled my lungs as I hiked through the forest, the only sounds being the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional bird call. I came across a small stream with crystal-clear water and stopped to rest. Sitting there, I felt a rare sense of tranquility. On my way back to the RV, I noticed something odd, a rusted hunting trap lying just off the path. It seemed old but recently disturbed. I didn't think much of it, chalking it up to leftover equipment from hunters or trappers. That evening, I built a campfire and cooked a simple meal. As darkness settled, the forest became eerily quiet. The stars were brilliant overhead, and I found myself lost in their glow until the crack of a branch snapped me back to reality. Probably just wildlife, I told myself. The next morning, I decided to venture farther out. I packed a day's worth of supplies and headed north. The trail became less defined, and the signs of human passage faded. About midday, I stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin. It looked abandoned, with moss-covered logs and a roof caving in on one side. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached. The door hung loosely on its hinges. Inside, the cabin was sparse, just a broken table and a few scattered tools. Then I saw the walls. They were covered in newspaper clippings and photographs. Stepping closer, I realized the clippings were about missing persons, all from different parts of Canada and Alaska. An uneasy feeling crept over me. The photographs were of people, campers, hikers, even locals, all looking happy and unaware. Some had red X's marked across them. I felt like an intruder in someone else's twisted world. I decided it was time to head back. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A notebook on the floor, partially hidden under debris. I picked it up and flipped through the pages. It was a journal filled with meticulous notes about tracking movements, habits, and patterns of various people. Dates matched the times when some of the individuals had gone missing. A sense of urgency overtook me. I needed to get out of there and inform the authorities. Clutching the notebook, I exited the cabin and started back toward my RV. The forest seemed different now, darker, more confining. Every sound was amplified. I quickened my pace, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Then I heard it, a distant whistle, the kind someone would use to signal. I glanced back but saw nothing. Picking up speed, I moved as quickly as the terrain would allow. Suddenly, a figure stepped onto the path ahead of me. He was tall and rugged, with unkempt hair and a beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in years. He wore a tattered coat and carried a hunting rifle slung over his shoulder. "Lost?" he asked in a rough voice. "Just heading back to my camp," I replied, trying to sound casual while my heart pounded in my chest. "Not many folks come this way," he said, eyeing me up and down. His gaze settled on the notebook in my hand, and I noticed his eyes narrow. "Found this back there," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Figured it might belong to someone." He took a step closer. That so? Mind if I take a look? Actually, I'm in a bit of a hurry, I said, starting to move past him. He blocked my path. It's not safe out here alone. I'll manage, I replied, attempting to sidestep him. Without warning, he grabbed my arm with a grip like a vice. I insist. Adrenaline surged through me. I wrenched my arm free and broke into a run. Behind me, I heard him curse and give chase. The forest blurred as I dodged trees and jumped over roots. The heavy footsteps behind me were getting closer. A shot rang out, splintering a tree trunk to my right. Panic threatened to overtake me, but I forced myself to focus. Up ahead, I spotted a ravine with a fallen log bridging it. I sprinted toward it, hoping to put some distance between us. I scrambled across the log, the drop below steep and unforgiving. Halfway across, another shot echoed, and the log shuddered. I didn't look back. Reaching the other side, I continued running. My lungs burned, and every muscle screamed, but I couldn't stop. The forest began to thin, and I recognized a landmark, a peculiar rock formation I'd noted earlier. Relief washed over me. The RV was less than a mile away. Bursting into the clearing, I dashed toward my vehicle, fumbling with the keys. I heard footsteps emerging from the forest edge. I managed to unlock the door and threw myself inside, slamming it shut just as the man reached the clearing. He stood there, a sinister smile creeping across his face. Instead of approaching, he simply watched as I started the engine. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was still standing there, motionless. I drove straight to the nearest town, several hours away. At the local police station, I handed over the notebook and recounted everything. The officers exchanged glances, and one of them sighed. "You're not the first to report something like this," he said. Over the next few days, an investigation was launched. They found the cabin, but reported that it was empty. No clippings, no photographs, nothing. It was as if someone had cleared it out. Frustrated, I insisted on the evidence I'd seen. The notebook was the only tangible proof, and it was filled with disturbing observations. The authorities took it seriously enough to keep the case open. Back home, I couldn't shake what had happened. I started digging into missing persons reports in the Yukon and neighboring regions. Patterns began to emerge. Disappearances that happened annually, always around the same area. I learned that the man I encountered was likely Elias Kincaid, a former wilderness guide who went off the grid years ago after being suspected in several vanishings. He was never charged due to lack of evidence. It became clear that Elias was hunting people, using the vast wilderness as his cover. His motivation seemed rooted in a twisted desire for dominance and control, viewing the wilderness as his domain to enforce as he saw fit. I shared my findings with the authorities, but without concrete evidence of his current activities, their hands were tied. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Months later, news broke of a hiker who had gone missing in the same area. A search party found remains and signs of foul play. This time, with increased pressure, the authorities conducted a more thorough search and eventually apprehended Elias in a remote part of the forest. In the end, Elias Kincaid was charged with multiple counts related to kidnapping and murder. The notebook I had found played a crucial role in linking him to the crimes. As for me, I haven't returned to the wilderness since. The open skies and towering pines no longer hold the same allure. After the trial, it was revealed that Elias believed he was the rightful protector of the land, removing those he deemed unworthy of experiencing its beauty. His delusions drove him to commit unspeakable acts against unsuspecting travelers. I suppose if there's any dark humor to be found, it's that my quest for solitude led me straight into the path of a madman who despised intruders. Talk about getting away from it all. My name is Joseph Patel. I'm 38 years old, and I've spent the last 10 years chasing stories about nature and folklore, the kind of stories that make people look at their world differently. Most of the time, the mysteries I dig into have rational explanations. A trick of the wind, a misremembered tale. But what happened to me at Devil's Millhopper Geological State Park was different. It wasn't rational. This happened in October 2021. I had driven to Gainesville, Florida, to explore the park and camp overnight in my RV. Devil's Millhopper had been on my list for a while, thanks to the local legends swirling around its sinkhole, whispers of cursed settlers, strange disappearances, and echoes that didn't belong. It sounded like the perfect mix of history and mystery for my blog. I arrived late in the afternoon. The park was quiet. The off-season meant fewer tourists, which was fine by me. The air was humid, the kind that clings to your skin and makes everything feel a little heavier. I parked the RV in the lot closest to the sinkhole trail and set out to explore. The sinkhole itself was breathtaking, a massive crater carved into the earth and overgrown with lush greenery. Trails snaked down its sides, with wooden steps descending into the shadows. From the edge, I could hear water trickling far below, and every sound, birds, leaves rustling, even my own breathing, seemed amplified by the acoustics of the crater. I started down the steps, my camera in hand, pausing to take pictures of the layered limestone walls and hanging vines. The farther I went, the cooler the air became, and the light grew dimmer. About halfway down, I stopped. I heard something. Abby. It was faint, almost like the whisper of a breeze, but it was clear enough to make me freeze. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing strangely. No response, just the sound of water below and the occasional rustle of leaves. I shook it off. Acoustics, I told myself. Sound bounces in weird ways here. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that crept over me. Back at the RV, I started to notice small, annoying problems. The lights flickered when I turned them on, my GPS cut out briefly, and my phone couldn't seem to hold a charge. It wasn't anything I couldn't manage, but combined with the odd vibe of the park, it put me on edge. I made dinner, sat down to write some notes, and tried to distract myself. But as the sun dipped below the trees and the shadows deepened, that feeling of being watched settled over me. Around 9 p.m. I heard the first knock. 3 sharp raps on the side of the RV. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. "Hello?" I called out, sliding the curtain back to peer outside. Nothing. The empty parking lot stretched out under the pale glow of a nearby street lamp. A few minutes later it happened again. This time the knocks were softer, almost tentative, as if someone or something was testing me. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth, and the night was unnervingly silent. I circled the RV, shining the beam of light into every corner, but there was no one there. As I climbed back inside, I noticed something on the window, a small handprint smeared in the condensation. A child's handprint. The knocks didn't return, but the night was restless. I dreamed of water, of being pulled under by something I couldn't see. When I woke, the handprint was gone, though I hadn't touched it. Determined to shake off the fear, I headed back to the sinkhole. The morning light made it feel less oppressive, and I reminded myself why I was here, to find a story, not scare myself out of one. I started down the steps again, but this time I wasn't alone. A figure stood near the bottom, staring into the water below. "Good morning," I called out, my voice echoing. The figure turned, revealing a man in his 50s or 60s. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, his hat tilted low over his eyes. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice gravelly. I frowned. "It's a public park. I'm just exploring." He didn't respond, just turned back toward the water. "Why shouldn't I be here?" I pressed. "The echoes don't lie," he said. Then he walked away, disappearing into the woods at the base of the sinkhole. I spent the rest of the day trying to make sense of his words. Who was he? A park ranger? A local? His warning gnawed at me, especially when the whispers started again. This time they were louder, more insistent. "Abby," they called. "Come closer." I stood at the edge of the water, staring at my reflection. For a moment it looked wrong, distorted, like a face staring back at me from under the surface. I stumbled back, shaking my head. That evening I went into town to gather more information. The locals were friendly enough, but when I mentioned the sinkhole, they grew quiet. One woman, Martha, leaned in close. "You're not the first to hear things down there," she whispered. "Back in the 1800s, settlers disturbed something they shouldn't have. A burial site, they say. The spirits never left." "Do people still go missing?" I asked. "Not anymore," she said. "People learn to stay away." I didn't. That night the knocks returned, louder and more insistent. This time they were accompanied by faint crying, a child's voice pleading for help. "Help me," it whimpered, "please." I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. "Who's there?" The crying stopped. Then from the direction of the sinkhole I heard it again. Abby. I couldn't ignore it. Something compelled me to follow, to find out what was calling me. I grabbed my jacket and headed down the trail, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air grew colder as I descended, and the whispers grew louder. They weren't just calling my name anymore. They were accusing. "You let him die." I froze. "You didn't save him." The memory hit me like a punch to the gut. My brother Sam, drowning in the river while I stood frozen on the bank, too afraid to jump in after him. I'd been 15. That guilt had followed me ever since. But how could they know? At the bottom of the sinkhole, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing in on all sides. I shone my flashlight around, searching for something. Then I saw it. A figure stood across the water, cloaked in shadow. Its shape shifted as I watched, flickering between forms, a man, a child, something inhuman. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its voice was a distorted echo of my own. "You came," it said, its voice like nails scraping on glass. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. It stepped closer, and I realized its feet weren't touching the ground. "You," it said simply. I ran. The trail twisted before me, the trees closing in like grasping hands. The whispers followed, growing louder and more chaotic, overlapping into an unbearable cacophony. When I finally burst into the parking lot, the RV was dark. The engine sputtered as I tried to start it, but the headlights flickered and died. Then in the rearview mirror I saw the handprint. It wasn't alone this time. Dozens of handprints covered the windows, smeared as if clawing to get inside. I don't know how I made it through the night. I don't know how I managed to drive away when the RV finally started. What I do know is this: something lives in that sinkhole. I don't write about Devil's Millhopper anymore. Some stories are better left untold. But every now and then, when I'm alone, I hear it again, the echoes. My name's Ethan Carter, and this all went down in 2009 near the Rockies in Wyoming. I was there for what I thought would be an easygoing few days of camping with the RV, away from the noise of the city. I'd driven down from Missoula, Montana, where I worked construction, sometimes logging. After 3 years working with loud saws and hefting heavier beer bellies than my own, I figured some quiet nights and a view were just what I needed. I parked my RV off a dirt path in Bridger-Teton National Forest. The air was sharp but fresh, the kind that clears your head in a way you only appreciate when you're surrounded by concrete 5 days a week. My setup was simple. Parked near a small creek for water, camp chairs and a fire pit set up a stone's throw from the RV. After 2 nights of nothing but the sound of the stream and some elk clumping around in the woods, I'd started to think I'd lucked out. But then things took a turn. It was late, and I was sitting around the fire finishing up some chili when I heard the unmistakable sound of an engine in the distance. At first, I thought maybe it was a forest ranger or another camper lost on the winding trails, but this engine sounded ragged, like it was on its last leg, whining and sputtering as it got closer. A beat-up truck, rusted and dented, crept up along the path. I could see the outline of the driver in the dim light, a guy with a long, scruffy beard and a baseball cap pulled low. He stopped his truck a good 50 yards from my RV, then just sat there, the engine idling. I waved, as you do, just to acknowledge his presence and make it clear I wasn't a threat. He didn't wave back, didn't turn off his headlights, just sat there like a statue. After a while, I called out to him, asking if he was lost or needed help. He didn't respond. Now, I'm not one to spook easily, but there's something about being watched in the middle of nowhere that'll make anyone feel off. I kept an eye on him for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 15 minutes. Finally, the truck's engine died, but the guy didn't step out. He just stayed in his seat, staring forward. I got up, half expecting him to come over, maybe ask for directions or a drink, but he didn't budge. I went back into the RV, locked the door, and watched him from the small window. I thought he'd leave or maybe pass out in his truck, but around midnight he stepped out, slamming the door so hard it echoed. He was big, barrel-chested, with hands like slabs of meat, wearing some kind of old leather jacket that looked stiff as a board. He took a few steps toward my RV, then stopped. He didn't say anything, didn't try to introduce himself, just stood there in the dark. I stayed in the RV, hoping he'd get the hint and leave. Instead, he turned, walked back to his truck and disappeared into the trees, leaving his truck abandoned on the path. The fire outside had burned down to embers, so I was alone with the silence, the RV dark save for the faint glow of a battery-operated lamp. Every sound felt amplified, the creak, the occasional crack of a branch. I told myself he was probably just a local drunk and weird. I tried to shake off the unease, reminding myself I was in Wyoming, where everyone's a little more rugged than you'd expect. But I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m. I heard shuffling around the RV. I held my breath, hoping it was just a deer, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Peering through the window, I saw him again, closer this time. He'd ditched his jacket, his shirt covered in grime, his chest heaving as he looked around the campsite. I thought of calling out, but something in his stance, leaning forward, his face half lit by the moon, made me think twice. Instead, I stayed silent, gripping a small hunting knife I kept in the RV for emergencies. He started rummaging around my campsite, tossing my folding chair and stomping on the fire pit stones, scattering ashes everywhere. He was talking to himself, mumbling words lost to the sound of the creek and rustling leaves. Then he circled the RV, his fingers tracing along the side, tapping at the windows like he was trying to gauge if anyone was inside. I could hear him muttering under his breath, but nothing made sense. He seemed angry, frustrated, like he was looking for something, or someone. At one point he banged on the RV door hard enough that the entire vehicle shook. I sat still, barely breathing, knife in hand, praying he'd get bored and leave. Instead, he pulled a crowbar from his belt and started prying at the door. That was it for me. I grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and pointed it right at him through the window. For a moment he froze, staring at me with something between surprise and amusement. He tilted his head, gave me a half-smile that was anything but friendly, and then stepped back. My heart was hammering. The guy was built like a freight train, and I wasn't exactly armed for a showdown. He took another step back, his eyes flicking between me and the door, probably sizing up how much trouble I'd be. Then he laughed, a cold, hollow sound, and turned, vanishing into the tree line. I stayed up the rest of the night, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other, listening for any sound that might mean he was coming back. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As the first light hit, I packed up what I could, tossed everything in the RV, and was ready to hightail it out of there. But before I could start the engine, I saw something in the dirt by my fire pit. A piece of cloth, an old shirt, torn and stained, lay half buried in the dirt along with a rusty pocket knife and some cigarette butts. I grabbed the cloth and tossed it in the trash bag I kept for the trip, then looked around, trying to figure out where he'd gone. My eyes landed on a small trail leading away from my sight. I wasn't about to follow it, but something caught my eye. A pair of women's shoes, small, dainty, and covered in mud, abandoned near the base of a tree. I didn't want to think about what those shoes meant, but something about that trail felt wrong. I should have left right then, but curiosity got the best of me. I took a few cautious steps down the path, scanning the area, half expecting the guy to jump out from behind a tree. The trail wound down toward a ravine, where I spotted a few more discarded items. A torn purse, a broken phone, and something that made my stomach drop, a leather-bound notebook. The notebook was smeared with dirt and barely legible, but the pages that were readable were like something out of a horror novel. Notes about collecting, scribbled reminders about staying quiet and hunting times. There were names listed, dates, even some crude maps marking locations across the forest. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there, but I couldn't help but flip through more pages. Each name had a date and a description. The brunette by the lake, hiker with the red jacket, and then, chillingly, guy in the RV. That was when I dropped the notebook, every nerve in my body on fire. I sprinted back to the RV, jumped in, and cranked the engine. As I looked back toward the trail, I saw him again, watching from the trees, a twisted smile on his face. He knew I'd found his little journal, and he didn't seem to care. If anything, he seemed pleased, like he'd been hoping I would. As I pulled out of the campsite, he stepped out of the trees, standing in the middle of the road, watching me drive away. I floored it, not caring if I wrecked the suspension on the rocky trail. All I wanted was to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. It wasn't until I hit the main road that I finally let myself breathe, hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I thought about calling the Rangers, but something told me this guy knew the area too well, that he'd be long gone by the time anyone showed up. Instead, I kept driving, leaving Wyoming in the rearview. Days later, curiosity got the best of me, and I started digging around online. I found reports of missing hikers in the area, people who'd vanished without a trace. Every now and then, there'd be a mention of someone matching the description of the man I'd encountered, a drifter. A supposed survivalist who'd been spotted along trails, camping in the wild. I couldn't shake the last line I'd read in that notebook, the only one scrawled with an eerie precision. Bane last one. Time to move. My name is Daniel Powell, and I'm 41 years old. For the past 2 years, I've been living out of my RV, roaming from one campsite to another. It started as a way to escape the suffocating routines of my old life, my job as a firefighter, the divorce that followed, and the guilt after a child died in a fire I couldn't save. I told myself the open road would give me freedom. What I didn't know was how easily freedom can turn into isolation. This happened in November 2022. I had heard about Tate's Hell State Forest on an RV forum. The name caught my attention immediately, and the photos of its dense, hauntingly beautiful landscape sealed the deal. A slice of heaven, one user wrote. If you don't mind the legends, another added. That should have been my first red flag, but I shrugged it off. They were just stories, right? I arrived late in the afternoon. The forest was sprawling and eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you second-guess your every move. A ranger station sat near the entrance, but it was empty. A handwritten sign on the door reading, "Closed for the season." Perfect, I thought. No tourists, just me and nature. I found a clearing about half a mile in and parked my RV. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the fading sunlight cast long, twisting shadows across the trees. I set up a small fire pit and unrolled my camping chair, ready to enjoy the solitude. Before I could sit, an old man emerged from the trees. His grey beard was scraggly, his clothes worn and patched. He carried a fishing rod and a bucket of bait, though I hadn't seen any rivers or ponds nearby. "Evening," he said, his voice raspy but friendly enough. "Didn't expect company this deep in." I smiled. "Just passing through. Needed some quiet." The old man chuckled. "Quiet, huh? You picked the right place. Quiet as the grave." He let the words hang in the air, his smile fading. "Just don't wander too far, son. These woods, they don't always let folks find their way back." "Superstition?" I asked. "Something like that," he said, adjusting his bucket. "They say this place got cursed a long time ago. A witch burned alive by settlers, and she cursed the forest with her last breath. Now it's hers. People hear whispers, see things, and if she don't like you..." He trailed off, letting the silence speak for itself. I thanked him for the warning, though I didn't believe a word of it. He tipped his hat and disappeared into the trees, his footsteps fading with the day's light. That night, my RV lost power. I was in the middle of cooking dinner when the lights flickered and died, leaving me in darkness except for the glow of my lantern. My phone, fully charged just an hour ago, was suddenly at 5%. A coincidence, I told myself. Old wiring and a cheap charger. Nothing supernatural. I stepped outside to check the generator and was met with the kind of silence that felt alive. No insects chirping, no wind rustling the branches, just a dense, oppressive stillness. The air was colder than it should have been for November, biting at my skin. As I fiddled with the generator, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. A figure, pale and fleeting, at the edge of the clearing. My heart skipped. I spun, Flashlight in hand, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. The next day I decided to explore the trails. The morning sun burned off the eerie chill, and the forest seemed more inviting. I followed a narrow path that twisted through thick pines and cypress trees, their roots gnarled like ancient fingers clawing at the earth. I wasn't far in when I noticed symbols carved into the trees, crudely drawn but deliberate, circles, triangles, and shapes I couldn't recognize. They repeated every few feet, as if marking a path. I took pictures, thinking they might make a good addition to the blog post I was planning. The deeper I went, the stranger things became. Landmarks I swore I'd passed once before seemed to appear again, as though the forest were shifting. At one point I found myself walking in circles, the same carved tree greeting me no matter which direction I chose. Then I saw her. A woman stood ahead on the trail, barefoot and dressed in a tattered white gown that looked centuries out of place. Her hair was long and matted, her face pale and drawn. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at me with eyes that seemed too large for her face. "Hello," I called, keeping my voice steady. She raised a hand, pointing back the way I'd come. "Don't go further," she said. Her voice was soft but carried a weight that made my chest tighten. "Are you lost?" I asked, stepping closer. She shook her head. "Go back. Now." Before I could respond, she turned and vanished into the trees, leaving no trace of her presence. By the time I made it back to the RV, the sun was setting. The carvings on the trees had spread closer to my campsite, as though someone or something had been working while I was gone. I tried to rationalize it. Vandals, locals playing tricks. But my nerves were fraying. That night, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, barely audible over the crackle of the campfire. But as the hours passed, they grew louder, more distinct. My name, over and over, carried on the wind. Daniel. I bolted inside the RV, locking the door and closing every curtain. The whispers didn't stop. They pressed against the walls, seeping through the cracks surrounding me. And then the knocking started. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the back door. I grabbed a flashlight and threw the door open, half expecting to see the old man or the pale woman. But there was no one there. Only a fresh carving on the doorframe, a triangle etched deep into the wood. By the 3rd day, I was unraveling. Sleep had been impossible, and my supplies were running low. The forest seemed to close in tighter with every passing hour, the trees pressing closer to the RV like an encroaching tide. That evening, she came again. The woman in white stood just outside the firelight, her face obscured by shadows. "You stayed," she said, her voice tinged with sorrow. "I don't want trouble," I said, clutching the hatchet I'd kept by my side. "You've brought it," she replied. "What do you want from me?" She stepped closer, the firelight revealing her face, or what was left of it. Her skin was cracked and blistered as if burned, and her eyes glowed faintly with an unnatural light. "This forest is mine," she said, her voice a guttural growl that barely resembled the soft tones from before. "You trespass, you defy, and now you pay." The forest erupted around me. Shadows sprang to life, twisting into monstrous forms with gnarled limbs and hollow eyes. They circled the RV, their whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. I stumbled back, clutching the hatchet, and kicked over the firewood. Flames leapt higher, casting frantic light on the clearing. "Leave me alone!" I shouted, slashing wildly at the shadows. The woman in white stood at the edge of the firelight, watching with an expression I couldn't read, mocking, pitying. In desperation, I grabbed one of the carved symbols I'd taken from the forest, a small piece of wood etched with a triangle, and hurled it into the fire. The effect was immediate. The shadows recoiled, their forms dissolving into smoke. The woman in white let out an ear-piercing shriek before fading into the night. By dawn, the forest was still again. The carvings were gone, the RV's power restored, as though none of it had ever happened. But as I drove away, I caught one last glimpse in the rearview mirror, a single carved triangle on the last tree before the road turned. A warning or a reminder, I don't know. What I do know is this: Tate's Hell isn't just a name, it's a promise. My name is Samuel Patel, and I'm 30 years old. This happened in early March during what was supposed to be a peaceful RV trip to Devil's Millhopper Geological State Park in Gainesville, Florida. I've been blogging about my outdoor adventures for years, and this trip was meant to capture the park's breathtaking sinkhole, unique geology, and untouched trails. What I found instead was something I still can't explain, something I'll never forget. The drive to Devil's Millhopper was uneventful, just the way I like it. The RV hummed along steadily, and I listened to an audiobook about Florida's hidden gems. I arrived at the park in the late afternoon, the sun casting long golden shadows through the dense forest. Parking the RV near the campground, I stepped outside, inhaling the cool, earthy air. The place was quiet, too quiet. No distant chatter from other hikers, no bird calls, no rustling leaves. I brushed off the unease, chalking it up to my overactive imagination, and set up camp. After a quick dinner of instant noodles, I decided to explore the main attraction, the sinkhole. Devil's Millhopper is breathtaking. The sinkhole is massive, like an ancient wound in the Earth's surface, surrounded by lush vegetation and steep wooden stairs leading down to the bottom. I was struck by how the air felt heavier here, cooler and damp like stepping into another world. As I circled the rim, my boot scuffed something buried in the dirt. Curious, I crouched down and brushed away the soil. It was a small carved stone, weathered and cracked, with faint etchings that looked like symbols or runes. I took a photo with my camera, thinking it might be an artifact worth mentioning in my blog. The light was fading fast, so I decided to head back to the RV. That night, as I sat in the RV editing photos, the first odd thing happened. The photo of the carved stone, one of dozens I'd taken that day, appeared strange. The stone in the image glowed faintly, though I hadn't noticed anything unusual when I took it. My laptop flickered, then shut off completely. The power in the RV had been fine all day, but now the lights dimmed and my phone refused to charge. Then came the sound, faint, mournful singing, like a lullaby drifting through the trees. I froze, the hair on my arms standing on end. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe the wind through the trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I decided to ask one of the park rangers about the sinkhole and the carved stone. The ranger, an older man named Bill, was initially friendly but grew tense when I mentioned the stone. "You found what?" he asked, his voice tight. I described the artifact, showing him the photo on my camera. His face darkened. "You shouldn't have touched that." "Why not?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Is it part of the park's history?" Bill hesitated. "There's a story. Locals call it a curse. They say the sinkhole was sacred ground for the indigenous people who lived here long ago. There was a woman, a shaman or healer, who threw herself into the sinkhole after her village was massacred. Folks say her spirit still lingers, protecting the land." I laughed nervously. "A ghost story, huh? That'll make for a great blog post." Bill didn't smile. "It's not just a story. Leave the stone where you found it and be careful." That afternoon I hiked the trail again, determined to get more photos for my blog. The carved stone was still where I'd found it, half buried in the dirt. I felt a strange pull toward it, as if it were calling to me. I snapped another photo and moved on. That's when things got weird. The trail, which I'd walked just the day before, seemed unfamiliar. No matter how far I went, I kept circling back to the same spot, the edge of the sinkhole. My GPS glitched, showing my position as a spiraling loop. Frustrated, I decided to retrace my steps, but the woods had grown darker, the trees casting long shadows that seemed to reach for me. The air grew colder, and I began to feel lightheaded. I don't know how long I wandered before I finally stumbled back to the RV, my legs trembling. When I checked my watch, 3 hours had passed, though it felt like minutes. That night, I dreamed of the sinkhole. In the dream, I was standing at the bottom, surrounded by murky water. A woman emerged from the shadows, her face pale, her eyes black voids. She didn't speak, but I felt her rage, her sorrow, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The RV was ice cold, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth. Then I heard it again, the singing, closer this time. My flashlight flickered as I stepped outside. The forest was eerily still. the shadows between the trees darker than they should have been. And then I saw her. She stood at the edge of the woods, her figure translucent and shimmering. Her long hair clung to her wet, emaciated frame, and her hollow eyes locked onto mine. My body froze, my breath hitching in my throat. She raised a hand and pointed toward the sinkhole. The next morning, I knew I couldn't stay. I packed up the RV and tried to leave, but the engine wouldn't start. It groaned and sputtered, refusing to turn over. Panic clawed at me as I realized I was trapped. Desperate, I returned to the sinkhole, the carved stone in my hand. The air was thick with tension, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. "I'm sorry," I shouted, my voice echoing off the walls of the sinkhole. "I didn't mean to disturb you." The ground beneath me trembled, and the figure appeared again, rising from the shadows. She pointed at the stone, her hollow eyes burning with intensity. I dropped it, letting it roll into the depths of the sinkhole. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the air grew lighter, and the oppressive weight lifted. The figure faded, leaving me alone at the edge of the sinkhole. Back at the RV, the engine roared to life on the first try. I didn't look back as I drove away, the forest retreating in my rear-view mirror. But even now, months later, I can't forget the way she looked at me, like she was warning me, or maybe pleading for help. And sometimes late at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear that mournful singing. My name is Rachel Mosby. I'm 41 years old, and I've spent most of my adult life as a botanist, travelling to remote places to study rare plants. Last year I was hired by a conservation group to locate and document a species of moss known as Calluna sula. It's an elusive, high-altitude moss with supposed medicinal properties that grows only in shaded environments. This was a dream job, or so I thought. The trip brought me to Watchis Mountain State Reservation in Massachusetts. I'd heard stories about the area's eerie history, rumors of witch trials, hikers going missing, and strange symbols carved into the trees, but I dismissed all of it. I'm a scientist. Facts, not folklore, are my guide, or at least they were. Everything I experienced on that mountain changed the way I see the world. I arrived at Watchis on a crisp autumn afternoon. The air was thick with the scent of fallen leaves, and the trees wore the fiery colours of late October. I parked my RV in a small isolated lot at the base of the mountain. The closest campers were miles away, and I liked it that way. Solitude helps me focus. After setting up camp, I drove into the nearby town to stock up on supplies. The general store was small, dimly lit, and run by an older woman named Martha Keyes. She greeted me with a polite but curious smile, like she wasn't used to seeing strangers. "What brings you to Watchis?" she asked, handing me a paper bag of trail snacks. "Work," I said. "I'm a botanist here to study some rare moss." Martha's smile faded. "You be careful up there. The mountain's got its stories." "What kind of stories?" She hesitated, then leaned in, her voice dropping. "Watchis has got a witch, or it did back in the 1700s. They say she cursed the land before disappearing into the woods. People go up there and don't come back." I smiled politely, hiding my skepticism. "I'll keep that in mind." Her hand lingered on the counter. "Take only what you need, and if you find something that doesn't belong to you, leave it be." Back at the RV, I prepped my gear. A GPS, notebooks, a camera, and several collection jars. I planned to start early the next morning. My goal was to hike toward the summit where the moss was most likely to grow. The trail was steep and rocky, but I've handled worse. As long as the weather held, it would be a straightforward trip. But things started going wrong almost immediately. On the first day, I noticed the forest was unusually quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of my boots on the trail. The air felt heavy, like it carried a weight I couldn't see. I brushed it off as nerves. New places often had that effect on me. About halfway up the trail, I found my first clue, strange symbols carved into the bark of a tree. They were rough, like they'd been gouged out with a knife or a sharp rock, and they formed spirals that seemed to twist endlessly inward. I stopped to take a photo. That's when I heard it, singing. It was faint, almost too quiet to notice, but unmistakably human, a woman's voice, soft and melodic, drifting through the trees. I froze, straining to locate the source, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Hello?" I called, but the singing stopped. I waited a moment before moving on, telling myself it was just the wind or maybe another hiker, but deep down, I knew I was alone. By late afternoon, I reached a plateau where the trail split. One path led to the summit, the other veered into denser forest. My GPS flickered, its screen glitching, but I was confident I could navigate back. I decided to explore the offshoot trail, hoping it would lead to a shaded area where the moss might thrive. It was there that I found it, the moss I'd been searching for. It grew in a circle at the base of a massive, gnarled tree. The tree's bark was blackened, as if it had been scorched, and its roots twisted like skeletal hands. The air around it was colder than the rest of the forest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I approached, I noticed something hanging from a low branch, a bundle of sticks tied together with red string. It looked like some kind of talisman or charm. I reached for it, but a sudden gust of wind made the bundle sway, releasing a foul, earthy stench. I recoiled, heart pounding. I focused on the moss instead, carefully collecting samples and documenting its location. As I worked, the singing returned, louder this time. It was closer. I glanced around but saw nothing. The sun was sinking, and shadows stretched long across the forest floor. I decided it was time to head back. That night, the unease lingered. I reviewed my photos and notes in the RV, trying to distract myself, but the singing haunted me, even when it wasn't there. I could almost hear it, a faint echo in the back of my mind. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside. They were light, deliberate, circling the RV. I stayed still, barely breathing, listening as they paused near the door. Then came the softest knock, just a single tap. I grabbed my flashlight and swung the door open, shining the beam into the clearing. No one was there, but the footsteps resumed, retreating into the woods. And faintly on the wind, I heard the singing again. The next morning, I found footprints around the RV. They were small, almost childlike, and they led toward the trail. My gut told me to leave, but my work wasn't finished. I convinced myself it was an animal or some prank by another camper, even though I hadn't seen anyone else on the mountain. I hiked back to the gnarled tree, determined to finish collecting data. But when I arrived, something was wrong. The bundle of sticks was gone, and in its place was a rusted blade embedded in the tree's trunk. The bark around it bled a dark sap, and the moss I'd collected the day before had turned black and withered. I felt a presence behind me and spun around, but the forest was empty. The singing started again, rising and falling like a chant. This time it was accompanied by faint whispers, too low to understand. I backed away from the tree, my heart racing. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift, and for the first time I saw her. A figure stood in the distance, barely visible through the trees. She was draped in tattered, old-fashioned clothing. Her face was obscured by shadow. Her eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the dim light like a predator's. She didn't move, but she raised a hand and pointed toward the summit. I ran back to the RV, my breath ragged. I locked the door and sat trembling, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I thought of Martha's warning, take only what you need, leave it be. I stayed up all night, clutching a flashlight. The singing didn't stop. This time it grew louder, circling the RV like a storm. At dawn, I drove straight to the general store and told Martha what had happened. She listened quietly, her face pale. She doesn't like trespassers, Martha said, and she doesn't forgive thieves. What do I do? I asked. Martha handed me a pouch of herbs. Take everything you've collected and leave it at the tree. Apologize out loud, then leave, and don't come back. I followed her instructions. Back at the tree, I emptied my collection jars and placed them at its base. My voice shook as I whispered an apology, promising to leave the mountain and never return. The forest fell silent. No singing, no whispers, just an oppressive stillness. I backed away, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of the figure. She didn't appear. Relieved, I returned to the RV and started the engine. As I drove away, the mountain loomed in the rearview mirror, its dark silhouette etched against the sky. I told myself it was over, but even now, months later, I can still hear the singing in quiet moments. soft and distant, like a memory that refuses to fade. Some places aren't meant to be explored, and some things are better left undisturbed. My name is Callum Foster, and I remember this happened back in 2011, deep in the Ouachita National Forest, Arkansas. I had planned this RV camping trip to break out of my routine as a tax consultant. I didn't exactly have the wildest schedule, and every so often the quiet drove me up the wall. So, packed up, got my RV loaded with snacks, fishing gear, and a couple of mystery novels, and set off aiming to unwind, eat some terrible campfire meals, and maybe catch a fish or two if I was lucky. The Ouachita stretches for miles, and you can drive for hours without seeing another soul, perfect for a guy who needs some isolation therapy. I found a spot nestled between tall, unbothered pines and parked. It was far enough off any main trail to make it feel like I was in my own little slice of wilderness heaven, yet close enough that if I twisted my ankle or ran out of supplies, it wouldn't be a total disaster. The first night was peaceful, just the sound of crickets and the occasional rustling. I even caught myself chuckling at how silly it was to be so jittery at the slightest forest sound. By the next afternoon, I'd already fallen into the calm of the place. After grilling up some truly unfortunate hamburgers, I decided to take a hike to stretch my legs and maybe scout for a better fishing spot along the creek. I'd barely made it 100 yards from my RV when I noticed something strange. A dead rabbit hanging from a tree just a few feet off the trail. Now, I'm no stranger to odd sights in the woods, but this was different. The rabbit's body was stiff, dangling by what looked like a homemade snare, some kind of rough twine twisted around its neck. Maybe someone local had been out trapping and just left it there by mistake, I thought, trying to brush off the odd feelings settling in my gut. But as I walked back toward my RV, I noticed two more animals, small birds this time, hung from branches in a similar way, like little macabre decorations. The strange thing was, there wasn't a hint of decay. They couldn't have been hanging there for more than a few hours. Suddenly, my peaceful camping trip felt less like a retreat, and more like I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't meant to see. I picked up my pace back to the RV, thinking it might be best to move spots, maybe a little closer to a trailhead, but as soon as I got back to my site, I saw something else. Footprints, bare human footprints. They trailed around my RV, leading up to the door and looping back around toward the tree line. My first thought was maybe some prankster kids were trying to mess with me, but the prints were large, much too big for kids, and they were fresh. I could still see the damp impressions in the forest floor. The quiet was different now. It felt that the whole forest had gone dead silent, and every little crackle of a branch felt amplified. I climbed into the RV, closed the door, and locked it for all the good it would do. I sat down, trying to decide what to do next. My phone had no reception out here, so calling for help wasn't an option. I figured I'd sleep with one eye open, maybe head back out in the morning. The night was tense. I heard what I thought were branches snapping nearby, footsteps shuffling around my RV. Every time I turned off the interior lights to look outside, I saw nothing, just darkness pressing against the windows. Around midnight, I heard a soft scraping sound against the side of the RV, like someone dragging their hand across the metal. I grabbed the closest thing I had to a weapon, a fishing knife, and sat there waiting, barely breathing. The scraping sound moved, circling the RV slow and deliberate, then it stopped, and everything went quiet. By dawn I was exhausted, running on nothing but stale coffee and nerves. I stepped outside, hoping daylight might make me feel less paranoid, but I quickly noticed something that sent a chill up my spine. The footprints were back, fresh, leading directly to my RV door and back to the tree line where they disappeared into the brush. I was done. I decided right then to pack up and head out. I was only halfway through loading everything back into the RV when I heard it, a low, strained voice from somewhere in the trees. "Leaving already?" I froze. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might actually burst. I scanned the trees but saw no one. I yelled out something unintelligible, something about this not being funny and calling the police, but the voice chuckled, mocking, cold. "Oh, I'm just getting started," it said, echoing through the trees like it was coming from everywhere at once. The voice was rough, a growl underneath, not like anything I'd ever heard from a human, but it had to be a person. I told myself that over and over. I finished packing as fast as I could, throwing things haphazardly into the RV, and climbed into the driver's seat, ready to get the hell out of there. But when I turned the key, the engine sputtered, coughed, and died. I tried again. Nothing. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely grip the wheel, and in a panic I jumped out, thinking maybe I could fix whatever was wrong if I opened up the hood. When I did, my stomach dropped. All the wiring was shredded. It looked like someone had taken a knife to every crucial part of the engine. In a blind panic, I decided my only option was to make a break for it on foot. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with water and snacks, and took off toward the nearest trailhead I'd seen when I drove in. It was supposed to be about 3 miles out, reachable if I kept up a good pace. I'd barely made it 10 minutes into my walk when I heard the footsteps behind me, soft at first, like someone trying to match my steps. I quickened my pace, and the footsteps followed. When I broke into a run, the footsteps behind me sped up too, and that's when I finally turned around. There he was, a hulking figure, close enough now that I could make out the twisted grin on his face, teeth bared in a half-smile that didn't reach his cold, sunken eyes. His hair was long, tangled, hanging over his shoulders like a matted mane, and he wore clothes so ragged they barely clung to his body. The worst part was his hands, long, clawed fingers that he flexed like he was itching to use them. I kept running, my mind racing through every mistake I'd made on this trip, every stupid decision that had led me here. I could hear him gaining on me, the heavy sound of his boots pounding the ground. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I remembered reading that people who live out here sometimes go a little feral. Whatever drove this man to the woods had taken every last piece of humanity from him, leaving nothing but a wild animal in human form. I stumbled, nearly tripping over a root, but I caught myself and kept moving. Up ahead, I saw what looked like a ranger's station, just an old, weather-beaten cabin on stilts. It was a long shot, but if I could get inside and lock the door, maybe I'd have a chance. I pushed myself harder, lungs burning, and made it to the cabin, throwing myself up the steps and slamming the door behind me. I bolted it shut, every nerve in my body firing as I pressed my back against the wood, trying to catch my breath. Outside, I could hear his footsteps slowing, then stopping. A shadow fell over the window, and then I heard it again. That voice, low, mocking. "You can't hide from me. Not out here." He pressed his face to the window, his grin wider, those teeth glinting in the dull morning light. He was holding something in his hand, a small, tattered notebook, worn down with age. He opened it, and that's when I saw the names written inside, each one crossed out, followed by a crude sketch of the forest and a line leading to a little X. My name was the last one on the list. I felt something shift inside me, a primal surge of fight or flight that almost drove me to open the door and charge him head on. Instead, I grabbed the first thing I saw, a rusted fire poker by the cabin's old stove, and held it out like a weapon. The man laughed, a harsh, guttural sound that bounced off the trees outside. "You're not the first," he sneered, "but you're the last today, anyway." He backed up a few steps, as if giving me a head start, and I took the opportunity to scan the cabin. There was an old radio on the counter, and I scrambled over, twisting the knobs, praying for even the faintest signal. Static crackled, and then, miraculously, a voice came through, muffled but there. "This is Ranger Station 14. Do you copy?" "Yes," I shouted, breathless. "Please, I'm in trouble. There's someone." Before I could finish, the window shattered. The man's hand shot through, clawing at the air. He was barely missing me. I ducked down, clutching the radio like a lifeline as he banged against the door, each hit harder than the last. "Just you and me now," he growled, his voice rising into a manic, almost gleeful tone. "No one's coming." The banging grew louder, more forceful, and I knew the door wouldn't hold. In a last-ditch effort, I pulled a chair up under the door handle, grabbed the fire poker, and braced myself. The door splintered, and he stepped through, eyes gleaming with an unholy excitement. He lunged toward me, but I swung the poker, catching him across the face. He staggered back, laughing a sick, twisted laugh that echoed through the cabin. Blood dripped from a gash on his cheek, and he wiped it away, smearing it like war paint across his face. I charged, swinging the poker again, and this time it hit hard enough that he dropped to one knee. But he was strong, almost inhumanly so, and he grabbed my wrist, twisting it until the poker fell from my grip. He pushed me to the ground, his hand around my throat, and I could feel his hot breath against my face as he leaned in close. "See, the thing about the woods," he whispered, "is they swallow up people like you." Then, with a sudden burst of strength, I shoved him off, scrambling to my feet. He lunged again, but this time I was ready. I grabbed the fire poker and plunged it into his chest. He staggered, his mouth opening in a silent scream as he fell backward, clutching the poker embedded in his chest. I didn't wait to see if he'd get up again. I ran out of that cabin, not stopping until I reached the trailhead. The rangers found him the next day, dead and stiff on the cabin floor. They said his name was Elroy Fitch, a local gone missing a decade earlier, only to resurface now as some kind of feral predator. His journal was filled with sketches of his victims, paths through the woods. They didn't ask me much, just took my statement and told me to get some rest. I left, but I watched that day, my RV untouched. His final words echoing in my mind, "The woods swallow up people like you." My name is Sebastian Williams, but everyone calls me Becky. I'm 38 years old, and I've spent the last 5 years of my life as a travel blogger, exploring forgotten trails, hidden spots, and spooky legends across the Midwest. This happened in October 2021, when I decided to camp alone in Morgan Monroe State Forest in Indiana. If you've never heard of the place, it's beautiful. Thick woods, crumbling stone walls from old farms, and trails that feel like they lead you straight into the past. But it's also got a darker side. Locals call it the most haunted forest in the state. People whisper about strange sounds, ghost lights, and something they call the Whistler. It's said that if you hear a whistle at night, you should never follow it, or you'll end up like the others who went missing in those woods. I didn't believe in any of it. That's why I went. I rolled into the forest in my little refurbished RV, a turquoise 78 Sunline I named Penny. Just before sunset, I parked in a clearing near the Fire Tower Trail, a spot I'd scouted online. The air was cool, and a mist was already creeping through the trees. Perfect ambience for the spooky blog post I had planned. I spent an hour setting up. Camera? Check. Tripod? Check. Voice recorder? Check. Everything was ready. I filmed a short intro for my vlog, explaining the legend of the Whistler and laughing about how I was going to debunk it. "This is Becky Harper," I said, pointing the camera at myself, "here to prove that not every creepy campfire story has teeth. Let's see if Morgan Monroe lives up to its reputation." As the sun dipped below the horizon, I lit a small fire outside the RV and settled in. I'd planned to start exploring after dark, but the forest had other ideas. It started around 9 p.m. I was editing photos by the fire when I heard it, a soft, lilting whistle drifting through the trees. It was faint, like someone far away, but clear enough to make me pause. At first, I thought it was another camper, maybe someone hiking the trail, but then I remembered the warnings. Never follow the whistle. I laughed to myself. It was probably just the wind. Still, I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the tree line, curiosity gnawing at me. There was no one there. The whistle came again, closer this time. It was melodic, almost like a lullaby, and it sent a shiver down my spine. For the first time that night, I felt uneasy. I decided to call it a night, retreating to the safety of the RV. But as I was locking the door, I heard footsteps circling the vehicle, slow, deliberate steps crunching on the fallen leaves. "Hello?" I called out, shining my flashlight into the darkness. Nothing. The firelight cast long shadows through the trees, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure, a man standing just out of reach. But when I focused on the spot, there was no one there. I shook my head. My imagination was running wild. I climbed into the RV and locked the door behind me. To distract myself, I reviewed the pictures I'd taken earlier. They were mostly shots of the trail and the crumbling stone walls nearby, but as I scrolled through, I noticed something odd. In one of the photos taken near the fire tower, there was a figure in the background. It was blurry, almost transparent, but definitely human-shaped. It hadn't been there when I snapped the picture. My stomach tightened. Maybe it was a trick of the light, maybe it was a tree, or maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. The next morning, I woke to find the forest blanketed in a thick fog. Visibility was terrible, but I was determined to explore. I grabbed my camera, flashlight, and a water bottle and set off toward the fire tower trail. The fog made everything feel off. Trees I'd passed the day before now looked unfamiliar, their branches twisting like skeletal arms. The trail seemed narrower, almost suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. About halfway up the trail, the whistle returned. It was louder now, echoing through the woods. The fire tower trail led to an old metal tower, rusted and abandoned, standing like a sentinel in the middle of the forest. It creaked in the wind, and the steps were slick with moss and rain. I climbed up anyway, hoping to get a better view of the foggy woods below. From the top, the whistle sounded again. It was coming from the base of the tower. My heart pounded as I peered down. There, in the swirling mist, was a figure. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall and thin, dressed in what looked like tattered old-fashioned clothes. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring up at me. "Hey!" I shouted. "Who are you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he started whistling again, the same haunting tune. I didn't wait to see what he would do. I scrambled down the ladder as fast as I could, nearly slipping on the wet metal. When I reached the ground, the figure was gone, but the whistle wasn't. It was everywhere now, surrounding me, growing louder and more insistent. I turned in circles, trying to pinpoint the source, but it was useless. The fog made the woods feel endless, like I'd stepped into another world. I ran. Branches clawed at my arms and legs as I stumbled down the trail, trying to find my way back to the RV. But the path twisted in ways it hadn't before, leading me deeper into the forest. The whistle followed me, growing closer with every step. Eventually, I tripped over a root and fell hard, scraping my palms on the rocky ground. When I looked up, the figure was standing over me. He was gaunt, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were hollow, and his mouth twisted into an unnatural smile as he whistled that same haunting tune. I tried to crawl away, but my body felt heavy, like the air itself was holding me down. The figure leaned closer, his face inches from mine. His breath smelled like ash and decay. Desperation took over. I fumbled in my pack and pulled out a handful of iron nails. I'd read somewhere that ghosts and spirits couldn't stand iron. I threw them at him, and the effect was immediate. The figure shrieked, his form flickering like a dying flame before dissolving into the mist. The pressure lifted, and I could move again. I didn't waste a second. I ran until I found the clearing where I'd parked the RV. I didn't stop to pack. I jumped into Penny, turned the key, and peeled out of there as fast as the old engine would let me. As I drove away, the fog thinned, and the forest began to look normal again. But just as I reached the edge of the woods, I heard it. One last time. The whistle. I didn't look back. When I got home, I reviewed the footage I'd captured. Most of it was unusable, blurry, overexposed, or mysteriously corrupted. But one clip stood out. It was a recording I didn't remember taking, showing the fire tower from below. In the corner of the frame, barely visible through the mist, was the figure. I posted my story anyway. It went viral, of course. People argued over the video, calling it fake, a publicity stunt, whatever. But I know what I saw, and I know I'll never go back to Morgan Monroe. My name is Jackson Allen. I'm 39 years old, and this happened last October near Devil's Hollow Road in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I'm a wildlife photographer and admittedly a skeptic. I've spent years exploring remote locations, capturing nature's raw beauty, and debunking myths of the paranormal along the way. Ghost stories, curses, strange creatures. They've all been entertaining tales, nothing more. That's what I thought, at least. I was wrong. I had just finalized my divorce a few weeks before and needed to clear my head. The open road seemed like the perfect escape, and my RV had everything I needed to stay off the grid while searching for a new project. I stumbled upon Devil's Hollow, a stretch of road surrounded by dense woods and an unsettling history. Supposedly, it was cursed by a witch named Evelyn Black, who was killed there in the 1800s after being blamed for several disappearances. The legend said her spirit still haunted the area, along with the lost ones, people who had vanished after trespassing near her old cabin. It was exactly the kind of story I wanted to explore, debunk, and prove wrong. I'd spend a couple of days photographing the area, maybe even find the ruins of Evelyn's cabin, and move on with a good story for my portfolio. I arrived in the late afternoon, parking my RV near a small clearing off the road. The air was damp, and the forest seemed unusually dark for the time of day. As I set up my camera gear, I noticed something odd about the trees. Their trunks twisted unnaturally as if they were leaning toward me. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to make the hair on my neck stand up. I started hiking just before dusk, following what looked like an old trail through the woods. The silence was oppressive. No birds, no rustling leaves. Just the sound of my own footsteps crunching on the dirt. About a mile in, I found it. A crumbled stone foundation overgrown with moss and vines. This had to be Evelyn Black's cabin. I snapped a few photos, but my camera kept malfunctioning. Every shot came out blurry, as if the lens was fogged, even though it wasn't. Annoyed, I packed up and made a mental note to come back in the morning with better light. As I turned to leave, I caught a faint whiff of smoke. It wasn't the sharp scent of burning wood. It was something sweeter, like incense. I looked around, but there was no sign of fire. The smell lingered all the way back to my RV. That night, the knocking started. I was sitting at the small table in the RV, reviewing my notes, when I heard it, a soft, deliberate knock on the window behind me. I froze. The campground was supposed to be deserted, and I hadn't seen a single car or hiker since I arrived. Slowly I turned and peeked out the curtain. Nothing. Just the dark forest, the shadows of trees swaying in the faint moonlight. Probably just a branch, I muttered, though I wasn't convinced. The knocking came again, this time on the side door. I grabbed a flashlight and opened it, shining the beam into the woods. Still nothing. But as I stepped back inside, I noticed them. Wet handprints on the window, small, child-sized handprints smeared in the condensation. My stomach turned. There were no kids out here. The next morning I returned to the ruins of the cabin, determined to get better shots. As I approached, the air grew colder and the forest seemed darker than before, even under the mid-morning sun. I heard whispers. At first I thought it was the wind, but the sound was too distinct, murmured voices just out of reach. I couldn't make out the words, but they were speaking my name. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. "Is someone there?" No response. Just the whispers growing fainter, as if they were retreating deeper into the woods. At the edge of the foundation I found something new, a circle of blackened stones, charred as if they'd been part of a fire. I crouched down, running my hand over one of the stones. It was warm. A twig snapped behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. No one except for a shadowy figure standing just inside the tree line. It was a woman, tall and thin, draped in black. Her face was hidden by a veil, and her posture was unnaturally stiff, as though she were being held up by invisible strings. "Evelyn," I whispered, though I didn't believe it. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. I blinked, and she was gone. I should have left then. Any sane person would have. But I was too stubborn, too determined to prove there was a logical explanation. That night, the knocking returned, louder, more insistent. It was on all sides of the RV now, coming from the windows, the roof, the door. I grabbed my flashlight and shouted, "Who's out there?" The knocking stopped, replaced by laughter, high-pitched, childlike laughter echoing from every direction. My blood ran cold. I slammed the flashlight onto the table, cracking the lens, and grabbed my camera instead. The screen flickered, but it worked long enough for me to capture a single photo through the windshield. The flash illuminated the woods for a split second, and I saw them, figures, dozens of them, standing in the trees. They were pale, almost translucent, their faces blurred like an out-of-focus image. The lost ones. The laughter grew louder, blending into whispers that filled the air like a swarm of insects. I clutched the camera to my chest and bolted for the driver's seat, starting the RV. As I turned the key, the headlights illuminated the road ahead. Evelyn was standing there, directly in front of me. Her veil was gone, revealing a hollow, eyeless face. Her mouth twisted into a terrible grin. The engine sputtered, refusing to start. "Come to me," she whispered, though her lips didn't move. The lost ones swarmed closer, their forms flickering like candle flames. They pressed their hands against the RV, their touch leaving streaks of frost on the glass. Desperate, I grabbed my camera. The broken lens buzzed with static, as if it were alive. Without thinking, I hurled it out the window toward the swamp on the side of the road. The second it hit the water, Evelyn let out a blood-curdling scream. The air around me seemed to collapse, rushing toward the swamp like a vacuum. The figures disappeared and the RV roared to life. I didn't look back. The next morning, I parked at a rest stop miles away, trying to convince myself it was over. But when I stepped outside, I saw something waiting for me on the RV's step. My camera bag. Inside was the photo I'd taken, the one with the lost ones. But this time there was something new. Evelyn's face reflected in the shadows. She was smiling. My name is Daniel Gonzalez. I'm 30 years old, a wildlife photographer, and I'm not the type to believe in ghost stories or urban legends. What I experienced last October at Yellow River State Forest in Iowa changed that forever. I was traveling solo in my RV, working on a photo essay called Forgotten Wild. The idea was to showcase remote, underappreciated natural areas and the wildlife that thrives there. My plan was simple: park the RV, set up trail cameras, and spend a few nights immersed in the forest. Yellow River was the perfect candidate, isolated, rugged, and teeming with wildlife. I arrived on a damp, overcast afternoon, the air thick with the smell of wet leaves and pine. The primitive campsite I chose was a mile from the nearest road, tucked between a creek and a dense patch of woods, perfectly remote. I parked my RV, set up a small fire pit, and spent the rest of the day exploring the area. The trails were slippery from recent rain, and I nearly twisted my ankle climbing down a ravine to position a camera trap by the creek. Still, I was optimistic. The forest was alive with movement. Deer tracks crisscrossed the mud, owls hooted overhead, and I even spotted a flash of tawny fur in the distance. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a chill crept in, and the forest seemed to exhale its vibrant energy, giving way to an eerie stillness. By the time I crawled into the RV for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The first sign that something was wrong came the next morning. I checked my trail camera near the creek, hoping for a glimpse of the cougar rumored to roam the area. Instead, the memory card was wiped clean. Not a single photo. Frustrated, I blamed a malfunction and decided to test the camera overnight near my campsite. While repositioning the trap, I noticed something strange in the mud. A set of tracks, large and humanoid, with long, claw-like toes. They didn't look like anything I'd seen before, and I've studied animal tracks for years. My logical brain tried to rationalize it, maybe a bear, distorted by the rain. That night, as I reviewed the day's photos in the RV, I heard it for the first time, a faint melody drifting through the trees. It was almost like humming, a low, mournful tune that rose and fell like a chant. I turned off the lights and peered out the window, my breath fogging the glass. The campsite was empty, the fire reduced to glowing embers. The song continued, growing louder, closer. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the darkness. The beam cut through the mist, but nothing moved. The song stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving the forest eerily quiet. The next day I woke to another unsettling discovery. My RV's tires were slashed. Deep gouges ran through the rubber, the edges jagged and uneven. A chill ran down my spine as I inspected the damage. Nearby, a pile of animal bones, small, likely rabbits, lay in a crude circle. Their placement seemed deliberate. I felt a surge of panic. Was someone stalking me? A poacher, maybe? I tried to brush it off, focusing on repairing the tires with the spare patches I always carried, but my unease grew with every passing hour. By late afternoon, the rain returned, turning the trails into a muddy mess. Determined to salvage something from the trip, I hiked back to the camera trap near the creek. That's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the water, partially obscured by the trees, was a figure, tall, thin, and unnaturally still. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its head bore a pair of antlers that jutted from its skull at impossible angles. My breath caught. The figure tilted its head toward me, its glowing yellow eyes piercing through the gloom. I stumbled backward, my camera falling into the mud. By the time I looked up again, it was gone. I returned to the RV in a panic, locking the doors and pulling the curtains shut. The forest outside felt alive, pulsating with an energy I couldn't explain. That night, the song returned. It started softly, just a whisper on the wind, but as the hours dragged on, it grew louder, filling the air with a haunting melody that seemed to seep into my bones. "Leave," I whispered to myself. "You need to leave." But when I stepped outside to check the RV, I realized it wasn't an option. The engine wouldn't start. The battery drained completely. The spare was missing, though I hadn't touched it since I arrived. I was trapped. The final night was a blur of terror. The song grew deafening, surrounding the RV in a cacophony of voices. Shadows flitted outside, too fast to track their movements, erratic and unnatural. Then came the pounding. Something slammed into the RV, rocking it violently. The windows rattled and the walls groaned under the force of the blows. I clutched my hunting knife, heart racing as the door handle jiggled. "Go away!" I screamed. The pounding stopped for a moment. The forest was silent again. Then a low, guttural voice whispered from just outside the door. "Daniel." My blood ran cold. Desperate, I grabbed the flare gun from my emergency kit and braced myself. If this thing wanted to come in, I wasn't going down without a fight. The door creaked open and I fired the flare into the night. The light illuminated the creature in full, its gaunt frame towering over me, its antlers scraping the roof of the RV. Its face was hollow, more skull than flesh, with jagged teeth that glinted in the red glow. The flare hit its chest, igniting a burst of sparks. The creature let out a bone-chilling scream, a sound so unnatural it made my ears ring. It retreated into the forest, its glowing eyes lingering in the darkness before disappearing completely. At dawn, I limped out of the RV, exhausted and bleeding from a deep gash on my leg where the creature had swiped at me. Using every ounce of strength, I patched the RV enough to limp down the gravel road. I never looked back. It's been months since that night, but the memories haunt me. I never finished Forgotten Wild. The photos I took at Yellow River were blurry and distorted, as if the camera had captured something beyond human comprehension. I don't know what I encountered in those woods, but I do know one thing. Some wildernesses are better left alone. My name is Alexander Mason, and I'm 60 years old. This happened in the fall of 2022, just after I retired as a forest ranger. I had spent over 30 years in the wilderness patrolling trails, chasing off bears, and sometimes even helping lost hikers find their way back to safety. You'd think a man like me would have no reason to be afraid of the woods, but I'm telling you what I experienced in the Hoare National Forest will haunt me for the rest of my days. I had just bought an old RV, a 1988 Winnebago. Nothing fancy, but it ran well enough. The plan was simple. Park it somewhere secluded, spend a few days camping, and finally get the peace I had been craving. My wife, Catherine, used to love trips like this. She passed 5 years ago in a hiking accident, one I couldn't prevent, and I still carry the guilt of it. I thought this trip might help me reconnect with her memory and maybe even forgive myself. I chose the Sycamore Trail in Hoare National Forest. It's not as busy as some of the other spots, and I knew the land like the back of my hand. The locals had always told stories about the area, warnings to stay away from certain trails, whispers of things that didn't belong in those woods, but I'd always chalked it up to superstition. After all, the forest can play tricks on your mind if you're not used to it. The first day went smoothly enough. I parked the RV in a small clearing just off the trailhead. It was a gorgeous spot, the kind of place Catherine would have loved. There was a crisp chill in the air, and the trees were blazed with autumn colors. I set up camp, got a fire going, and cooked myself a simple meal of canned chili. The only problem was my equipment. My old flashlight was flickering, and my camp stove gave me trouble lighting up. Nothing major, just annoyances, or so I thought. That night, as I sat by the fire, I started to feel off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on. The woods were quieter than they should have been. No crickets, no owls, not even the rustle of leaves, just dead silence. Then, just as I was about to head inside the RV, I heard something. Alexander. It was faint but unmistakable. Someone was calling my name. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. The voice sounded familiar, too familiar. It sounded like Catherine. "Alexander, help me." The voice was coming from deep in the woods, beyond the reach of my firelight. My heart was racing. I told myself it couldn't be her. It couldn't. But it sounded so real, so desperate. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the darkness. I didn't go far. My flashlight barely worked, and the further I moved from the fire, the darker and colder it got. That's when I saw them, tracks in the mud. They were strange, like a mix between human footprints and animal paw prints, as if someone had been walking barefoot but with claws. They led in a wide circle around my RV before disappearing into the woods. I stood there staring at the tracks, trying to make sense of them. That's when I heard the voice again, closer this time. "Alexander, please. It hurts." It was Catherine, or at least it sounded like her. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound tough. The forest didn't answer. I backed away slowly, my flashlight flickering, and retreated to the safety of the RV, locking the door behind me. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it was a bird mimicking her voice, maybe I was hearing things. But deep down, I knew better. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I spent the morning exploring the trail, hoping a good hike would clear my head. The woods were still unnervingly quiet, but nothing unusual happened. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. That's when the rain started, light at first, then heavy. I sprained my ankle, slipping on the wet ground while fetching firewood, cursing under my breath as I hobbled back to the RV. The storm made the forest even darker, and the flickering flashlight wasn't much help. That night, I heard scratching. It started faint, like branches brushing against the RV, but it grew louder and more deliberate. Something or someone was outside. I peered through the window, but all I saw was darkness. Then came the knocking. 3 sharp knocks on the side of the RV, followed by silence. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice shaking. No answer. I grabbed my hunting rifle and edged toward the door. My heart pounded as I threw it open, aiming into the night, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the faintest outline of a figure in the trees, tall and impossibly thin. The next morning I decided to leave. I'd had enough. But when I tried to start the RV, the engine wouldn't turn over. I checked under the hood, only to find deep scratches gouged into the metal, like claw marks. My chest tightened. I was trapped. Desperation took over. I grabbed my gear and decided to hike out, sprained ankle or not. But as I started down the trail, the forest seemed different. The trees felt closer, the shadows darker, the air thick, oppressive. Every step I took felt like I was being watched. Then I saw it. It was standing in the middle of the trail, about 50 yards ahead. At first it looked human, long limbs, pale skin. But as I stepped closer, its head jerked unnaturally and its body twisted, bending in ways no human body should. It turned toward me, and I swear it smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too many. "Alexander, back!" it said in Catherine's voice. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my rifle. It started walking toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. I ran. Pain shot through my ankle, but I didn't care. I ran as fast as I could, the creature's laughter echoing behind me. When I reached the old fire tower, I climbed up, hoping the height would give me an advantage. The creature followed. It circled the base of the tower, its voice shifting between Catherine's pleas and a low guttural growl. "Alexander, don't leave me," it whispered, its voice distorted and mocking. I remembered the stories, the ones I used to laugh at, skinwalkers, creatures that could mimic voices, take on forms and lure people to their deaths. The locals had always said salt could repel them. It was worth a shot. I dug into my pack and poured a ring of salt around the platform, gripping my rifle tightly. The creature climbed halfway up the tower, but as it neared the salt, it recoiled, letting out an ear-piercing shriek. It stared at me for a long moment, its dark eyes burning with rage, before it slithered back down the ladder and disappeared into the woods. When the sun rose, I climbed down the tower, my legs trembling. The forest felt lighter, less oppressive, but the tracks in the mud told me the creature was still out there. I hobbled back to the RV, praying the engine would start. This time, it did. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it standing at the edge of the forest. It didn't follow me, but I knew it was watching. I haven't been back to the Her National Forest since. I sold the RV, gave up camping, and tried to move on. But at night I still hear Catherine's voice calling to me from the darkness, and I'll never forget those eyes. My name is Michael Lopez, and I'm 28 years old. This happened in October of last year when my best friend Sophia and I decided to spend a weekend camping at Dogwood Lake, deep in the heart of southern Indiana. I'll never forget those days, no matter how hard I try. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the laughter. Sophia and I couldn't have been more different. She was bold, impulsive, and always looking for her next adventure. I, on the other hand, preferred plans, structure, and knowing exactly what I was walking into. But she had a way of pulling me out of my comfort zone, and I usually ended up having a good time. Usually, we'd rented an old RV for the trip, a boxy white thing with a sputtering engine that smelled faintly of mildew. I'd suggested staying in a cabin, but Sophia insisted the RV would be more authentic. After some back and forth, I gave in, as I always did. Besides, I was desperate for a break. My teaching job had been wearing me down, and Sophia's promise of crisp autumn air, hiking trails and kayaking sounded like the reset I needed. We arrived at Dogwood Recreation Area in the late afternoon, just as the sun was dipping below the treetops. The forest was alive with colour, fiery reds, deep oranges, and golden yellows that reflected off the still surface of the lake. It was beautiful, but something about the place felt off. I chalked it up to exhaustion and a touch of nerves. Sophia, of course, was thrilled. She grabbed her camera and started snapping photos the moment we parked. "Look at this light," she gushed. "It's perfect." I rolled my eyes but couldn't help smiling. That was Sophia, always chasing the perfect shot. After setting up camp, we decided to explore. There was a well-marked trailhead nearby, but Sophia had other ideas. She'd spotted a faint path leading off into the woods, one that wasn't on the map. "Let's check it out," she said, already heading in that direction. "Are you serious? It's getting dark," I protested. "That's the best time for photos," she called over her shoulder. "Come on, Michael, don't be such a buzzkill." Reluctantly, I followed. The trail, if you could call it that, was narrow and overgrown, twisting through dense trees that blocked out what little sunlight remained. I kept tripping over roots and brushing cobwebs from my face, muttering under my breath about poison ivy and ticks. Sophia, meanwhile, was in her element, snapping pictures of moss-covered rocks and fallen leaves. Then she found it. At first, I thought it was just a piece of trash, something shiny poking out of the dirt. But when Sophia bent down and picked it up, I realized it was a locket, an old one, tarnished and rusted but still intact. She turned it over in her hands, her eyes lighting up with curiosity. "Can you believe this? It's so vintage." "It's gross," I said. "Put it back." But she ignored me, rubbing the locket clean on her sleeve. "It's got initials engraved on it. I wonder who it belonged to." "Does it matter? It's trash." She shot me a look. "It's not trash, it's history." Then she slipped the locket into her pocket. "I'm keeping it." I didn't argue. What was the point? Sophia was stubborn, and once she'd made up her mind about something, there was no changing it. That night, things started to feel strange. The heater in the RV wouldn't work, so we huddled under blankets, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was out there watching us. But when I mentioned it to Sophia, she laughed it off. "You're just spooked because it's so quiet out here," she said. "City girl problems." Maybe she was right. I told myself I was imagining things and eventually drifted off to sleep. Then the dream started. I was standing by the lake, staring at the water. A woman stood on the shore, her back to me. Her hair was long and dark, and she wore a dress that clung to her as if it were soaked. She was holding something, a locket, I realized. Her shoulders shook as though she were crying, but no sound came out. When she turned around, her face was a mask of rage, her eyes hollow and black. She opened her mouth to scream, and I woke up, gasping for air. Across the RV, Sophia was sound asleep, the locket clutched in her hand. The next day, Sophia acted normal, but I couldn't shake the dream. I told her about it over breakfast, expecting her to laugh it off again. Instead, she frowned. "That's weird," she said. "I had a dream too, about a woman at the lake." "What did she do?" "She was just standing there watching me," she shrugged. "It didn't feel scary, though, just sad." I wasn't convinced. Something about the locket wasn't right, but Sophia refused to get rid of it. "It's just a coincidence," she said. "Don't freak out." But as the day went on, the unease grew. Wet footprints appeared on the RV floor, even though neither of us had been near the water. Items went missing, a flashlight, Sophia's phone charger, only to turn up later in odd places. And then there were the voices. That evening, as we sat by the fire, I heard it, the faint sound of children laughing. At first I thought it was my imagination, but Sophia heard it too. "Probably just echoes from another campsite," she said, though her tone was less certain. "There's no one else out here," I whispered. We stared into the darkness, but the laughter faded as quickly as it had come. That night, I woke to the sound of the RV door creaking open. Sophia's bed was empty. I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, my heart pounding. The forest was pitch black, the trees casting long shadows under the sliver of moonlight. I found Sophia standing at the edge of the lake, her feet submerged in the water. She was holding the locket, her lips moving as if she were whispering something, though I couldn't hear the words. "Sophia!" I yelled. She turned slowly, her eyes glazed over. "She wants me to stay," she said, her voice distant and hollow. I grabbed her arm and pulled her back to the RV, but she fought me, her strength unnaturally strong. "Let go, I need to go to her." Finally, I managed to drag her inside and lock the door. She collapsed onto her bed and fell into a deep sleep, but I stayed awake, clutching a knife and listening for the sound of footsteps outside. The next morning, Sophia didn't remember a thing. She laughed it off, but I could see the fear in her eyes. The locket's influence was growing stronger, and I knew we had to leave. But the RV wouldn't start. Sophia tried to call for help, but her phone was dead, even though it had been fully charged the night before. I suggested walking back to the main road, but she refused. "I'm not leaving the RV," she said. "What if someone comes by?" I didn't argue. I couldn't leave her alone, not when she was acting so strange. Instead, I decided to confront the problem head-on. That afternoon, while Sophia was napping, I took the locket and walked to the lake. The air grew colder the closer I got, and the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. I stood at the water's edge, the locket heavy in my hand. "I know you're here," I said. "What do you want?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then the surface of the lake rippled, and the woman appeared. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes dark pits of sorrow and rage. Behind her, shadowy figures emerged, children with hollow eyes and twisted smiles. "Return it," she hissed, her voice like nails on glass. "Return what you stole." I threw the locket into the water and turned to run, but the children's laughter erupted around me, and I felt icy hands grab my ankles. I screamed, kicking and clawing, but the hands dragged me toward the water. Just as I thought I was going to drown, Sophia appeared, her face twisted with fear and determination. She held a stick lit with fire from the RV stove. "Let her go," she screamed, thrusting the flame toward the water. The ghostly figures recoiled, their shrieks piercing the air. Sophia grabbed my arm and pulled me back to shore. Together, we watched as the locket sank beneath the surface, the ripples fading into stillness. We left Dogwood Lake the next day, abandoning the RV and hitchhiking back to civilization. Neither of us spoke about what had happened, but I knew we'd both been changed. Sophia never picked up her camera again, and I can't look at a lake without feeling a chill run down my spine. Some nights I still hear the laughter, soft and distant like an echo from a nightmare. I pray it's just my imagination, but deep down I know it's not. My name is Camila Adams. I'm 25 years old, and this happened to me last November. It started as a camping trip in Brown County State Park, Indiana, just a fun, challenging escape with friends. But what I experienced out there wasn't just nature. Something ancient and evil stalked us through that forest, and I barely made it out alive. It was Mason's idea. He was the ringleader in our group of 3, confident, outdoorsy, and just reckless enough to convince us this trip was a good idea. He was 26, with that charming, cocky smile that somehow made me trust him even when I shouldn't. Then there was Ben, Mason's best friend since childhood. He was 25 and the opposite of Mason, reserved, practical, and constantly trying to keep us from getting into trouble. Me? I was just there for the adventure. I'd been feeling stuck lately, living the same routine in Indianapolis, and Mason's enthusiasm made me want to break out of my comfort zone. So when he suggested we tackle an unofficial trail he'd found on some wilderness forum, I thought, why not? We packed light. Mason insisted we didn't need much for a 3-day trip. Looking back, that was mistake number 1. The first day went fine. We parked at the trailhead and hiked deeper into the park than I'd ever been. The colors of the late autumn forest were stunning, rich reds and golds under a steel-grey sky. Mason led the way with his usual bravado, joking about how we didn't even need a map, because he had the route all figured out. Ben kept muttering about how we should at least double-check our bearings, but Mason brushed him off. By the time we reached our first campsite, we were tired but in good spirits. We set up a small fire, ate some protein bars, and talked about everything and nothing under the canopy of stars. It was peaceful until the forest went silent. I didn't notice it at first, but Ben did. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. "Hear what?" Mason replied, poking at the fire. "Nothing," Ben said. "No crickets, no owls, nothing." Now that he mentioned it, the silence felt wrong. It pressed down on us like a weight, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Mason shrugged it off, saying it was probably the cold weather, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The second day was harder. The hidden path Mason had raved about turned out to be more of a rough deer trail, barely visible under the thick leaves. My legs ached from climbing over fallen trees and trudging through uneven ground. To make matters worse, Ben's compass stopped working. He swore it had been fine yesterday, but now the needle spun uselessly, as if the forest itself was messing with us. Around midday we found something strange. Deep claw marks scored the bark of a massive oak tree. They were too high up to be from a bear, if there were even bears in this part of Indiana. Mason joked about Bigfoot, but Ben's face darkened. "This isn't right," Ben said. "We should turn back." "Turn back? Come on, man, we're fine," Mason said. "Don't wimp out now." Ben shot me a look that said, "Can you believe this guy?" I wanted to agree with him, but I didn't want to be the one to back down first, so we kept going. That night, the hunger started. Mason devoured most of our food. He claimed he hadn't eaten enough earlier and needed the energy, but the way he tore through the rations was unsettling. His hands shook as he unwrapped granola bars, and his eyes had this wild, hollow look. "You okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, just starving," he muttered, not meeting my gaze. "Don't worry about it." Ben pulled me aside while Mason stomped off to gather more firewood. "Something's wrong with him," Ben whispered. "He's acting off." "I know," I said. "But what are we supposed to do, drag him back to the car?" Ben didn't answer. He just stared into the dark woods, his jaw tight. Later that night, I heard whispering. I'd stepped away from the campfire to use the bathroom. The air was freezing, my breath puffing white in front of me. That's when I heard it, a low, raspy murmur just beyond the tree line. "Ben? Mason?" I called, my voice shaking. There was no answer, only the sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot, too far away to be either of them. I ran back to camp, my heart pounding. "What's wrong?" Mason asked when he saw me. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. "Someone's out there," I said, trying to catch my breath. "I heard them." "It's probably just the wind," Mason said, but even he didn't sound convinced. Ben pulled out the flimsy flashlight Camilla had packed, the beam flickering weakly as he scanned the surrounding trees. "We need to leave first thing in the morning," he said. Morning didn't come fast enough. I woke up to the sound of Mason vomiting behind the tent. When I went to check on him, I saw blood mixed in with the bile. "You're sick," I said, panic rising in my chest. "We have to get you out of here." "No," Mason rasped, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "I'm fine." "You're not fine," Ben snapped. "You look like death, and now we're out of food thanks to you." Mason glared at him, his teeth bared. For a moment I thought he was going to lunge at Ben, but then he stumbled back, clutching his stomach. "Let's just keep moving," he said through gritted teeth. We packed up and started hiking, but Mason was slower now, his breath labored. The trail seemed to twist in on itself, leading us deeper into the forest instead of out. The claw marks appeared more frequently, gouged into the trees like some kind of territorial warning. And then we found the carcass. It was a deer, or at least what was left of one. Its ribs jutted out like spears, the flesh stripped away as if something had gnawed on it. The smell was overwhelming, rotting meat and coppery blood. Mason stared at it for a long time, his eyes wide and unblinking. "We need to keep moving," Ben said, grabbing my arm. That night, Mason disappeared. Ben and I woke up to find his sleeping bag empty, his boots gone. "We have to find him," I said, but Ben shook his head. "He's gone, Camilla. We can't save him." "We can't just leave him out there," I yelled. Ben sighed, his face lined with exhaustion. "Fine, but if we don't find him by sunset, we're heading back." We followed a faint trail of footprints, half expecting to find Mason sitting by a tree, laughing about some stupid prank. Instead, we found him crouched over another deer carcass, his face smeared with blood. "Mason?" I called out softly. He turned to look at us, and my stomach dropped. His eyes were sunk, his skin stretched taut over his cheekbones, his lips pulled back in a grotesque smile, revealing teeth that looked too sharp, too jagged. "The hunger," he whispered. "It's inside me." Ben grabbed my hand, pulling me back. "Run," he said. We ran, crashing through the underbrush, but Mason, or whatever he'd become, was fast. I could hear him behind us, his ragged breathing growing louder, closer. "Go!" Ben shouted, shoving me forward. "I'll hold him off!" "No!" I screamed, but Ben didn't stop. He turned to face Mason, wielding a large branch like a spear. I didn't see what happened next. I just kept running, tears streaming down my face as I heard Ben's screams echoing through the trees. I stumbled out of the forest at dawn, bloodied and half frozen. Park rangers found me near the trailhead and took me to a hospital. I told them everything, but they didn't believe me. They said Mason and Ben probably got lost and that I was lucky to make it out alive. But I know the truth. Somewhere in those woods, the Wendigo still roams, hungry and waiting for its next victim. The first time I took a wrong turn was back in 1998. I was heading from Pittsburgh to a small job in the Allegheny National Forest, a simple fencing gig that should have taken a day or two. I'd just started my own contracting business, more out of necessity than ambition. The recession had hit us hard, and I lost my cushy job at a steel mill, forcing me to pivot. That's when I started taking up whatever work I could get, building fences, clearing debris, anything to put food on the table. I'm not a guy who spooks easily. I grew up rough, learned to handle myself, so when the GPS signal dropped and the winding roads took me deeper into the forest, I didn't panic. I figured I'd make it through, maybe find a gas station or a diner where I could ask for directions. What I didn't count on was that old Ford pickup of mine sputtering and dying right there on that backwoods road, far from where anyone else would be driving. I stepped out, popped the hood, and cursed at the engine like that would magically fix it. I knew enough about cars to know I was screwed. No cell service, and judging by the dense trees and hills, no chance of stumbling on a signal. So I made a choice. I grabbed my toolkit and started walking, hoping I'd find a cabin or something. I figured I couldn't be too far off from some dirt road where someone would be kind enough to help out a stranded guy. But the deeper I walked, the more the trail seemed to shift under me, almost like it was leading me somewhere I didn't want to go. The towering trees blocked out the sun, leaving me with this constant twilight as I moved forward. After what felt like hours, I came across an old hunting cabin. It was roughly looking, weathered wood, sagging roof, like it hadn't been used in decades, but I wasn't about to be picky. I knocked, heard nothing, then tried the door. It creaked open with a whine that echoed through the trees, like something didn't want me there. The place smelled like mildew and rot. Inside, there was a table, 2 chairs and a fireplace. Simple, nothing special. But what caught my eye was a rifle hanging on the wall. I'd been around guns my whole life, and that rifle looked like it hadn't been fired in a long time. I walked over, grabbed it off the wall and checked it out. No bullets, of course. Not that I expected anything different. It just felt better having it in my hands. I was about to leave when I heard the sound of footsteps crunching in the leaves outside. It wasn't subtle either, like someone didn't care if I heard them coming. I peeked out the window and saw 3 figures moving slowly through the woods, not even trying to hide. They were dirty, disheveled, and dragging something heavy between them. Now, I'm not one to make snap judgments, but everything in me told me to get the hell out of there. I slid out the back door, crouching low as I made my way through the brush, trying to put as much distance between me and them as possible. But then I heard it. The unmistakable thud of something heavy hitting the cabin's front steps, the low murmurs of voices, muffled but unmistakable. I crept around the side, peering just far enough to see them. They had dropped what looked like a body in front of the door, a person, limp, wrapped in some kind of torn tarp. My stomach dropped as one of the men, bare-chested, sunburnt, and with greasy, matted hair, began to laugh. The sound echoed through the trees, but there was nothing joyful about it. It was a laugh of satisfaction, like someone proud of their work. They weren't just hauling a body, they were hauling their kill. I don't know what came over me, but I bolted. I ran hard and fast, my boots pounding into the earth, heart racing as the trees blurred past me. I didn't care where I was heading anymore. All I wanted was to get the hell out of those woods. The forest seemed endless, each tree like a copy of the last, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they knew I was there, that those men, no, those animals, had seen me run. After what felt like miles, I spotted an old barn through the trees, half collapsed and covered in moss. It was better than being out in the open, so I ducked inside, pulling the barn door shut behind me. My breath was heavy, heart racing, ears straining for any sound that might tell me they were following. I crouched low behind an old pile of hay, clutching the empty rifle as if it would protect me. Then I heard it, a dragging sound coming from outside the barn. It wasn't subtle. Someone or something was scraping something heavy along the dirt. The door creaked open just enough for a sliver of light to break through the dark interior. I could hear their ragged breathing, the shuffle of their filthy boots against the ground. I stayed still, barely breathing, praying they wouldn't look too closely. One of them stepped inside, and I could see him now, clear as day. A man, if you could call him that. His face was scarred, his teeth yellow and broken, and his clothes hung off his skeletal frame like rags. He dragged a large axe behind him, the metal scraping against the ground as he moved slowly, like he had all the time in the world. I thought I was dead. I thought for sure he would find me, and that would be it. But he turned and walked out of the barn, back into the woods with that same eerie calm. I waited a long time before I moved. Hours, maybe. I wasn't sure. When I finally felt brave enough, I crept out of the barn and headed back the way I had come, praying that I was going in the right direction. It was dark when I made it back to the road. My truck was still sitting there, lifeless, just as I had left it. But something was off. I could feel it as soon as I stepped out of the tree line. The air was colder, the sky too quiet. Then I saw it, a large figure standing next to my truck, silhouetted in the moonlight. The figure was hunched, broad-shouldered, and holding something that gleamed under the pale light. I didn't wait to find out who or what it was. I bolted again, running down the road as fast as my legs would carry me. I didn't stop, not even when I heard the engine of my truck roar to life behind me. The sound of tires crunching on gravel grew louder, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. Somehow, by sheer luck, I found myself on the edge of the forest, where the trees began to thin, and I could see a faint glow of lights in the distance. It was a town, some forgotten little place, but it was civilization. I stumbled toward it, my legs barely holding me up as I made my way down the dirt road. When I finally reached the first house, I collapsed on the porch, banging on the door like a madman. A man answered, his face full of confusion and concern as he helped me inside. I must have looked like hell. I didn't say much, just enough to get him to call the sheriff. The police came, of course, but when they went back to the woods, to the cabin, the barn, there was nothing there. No bodies, no blood, no sign of the men I had seen. But I knew better. They were out there somewhere in that forest, hunting. The sheriff didn't believe me at first, but when he saw the look in my eyes, the way my hands trembled, I think he knew I wasn't lying. He told me to keep quiet about it, that people around here didn't like outsiders stirring up trouble. I took his advice. I left that place, and I never looked back. But I know those men are still out there, deep in the Allegheny, waiting for the next poor soul to take a wrong turn like I did.